Hello and welcome to Purely Academic, your potentially educational podcast. This is the topic episode for November 2025, although it is coming out on December 1st. It's our podcast, we make the rules. I'm Dr. Jonathan Lack. I write about movies. I teach cinema studies at the University of Colorado, and I am about to proceed on a long and difficult voyage, the emergencies of which will demand all my fortitude.
And I'm Sean Chapman, high school English teacher by day, otaku by night, and I've been locked away in my secret laboratory, delving into the mysteries that animate life. I'm sure it's going to go swell.
Awesome. So if you can't tell from that intro, we are going to be talking all about Frankenstein today. Which Frankensteins, you may ask, because there's a lot.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the original, the genuine article, the modern Prometheus, if you will, the 1818 novel by Mary Shelley, which is, Sean, your favorite book, correct?
Yes, or, it's amongst my favorite books. It is in my top 10 eternally, but yes.
I believe it was your number one when we did that on the Weekly Stuff podcast, when we did a book countdown, wasn't it?
I can't remember if it was number one at that point or if it was Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's the lists can shift. But yes, it is in there as one of the all-time best.
But it's a book you've lived with for a long time. I had actually never read the original novel, which I read for this podcast, and I'm so glad I did because I'm right there with you, Sean. It's amazing. And we are also going to talk about two movie adaptations, one of which is the new one that makes this episode timely, the new film by Guillermo del Toro that is playing on Netflix and had a limited theatrical release just called Frankenstein, and the 1931 film, also just called Frankenstein, that doesn't really have anything to do with the book, but we're going to talk about it anyway for completion's sake, I guess. And that is, of course, the movie directed by James Whale and starring Boris Karloff from 1931.
Yeah, so that's the movie that creates the popular conception of Frankenstein is basically built out of that movie.
Right. And it's an interesting triple feature we have today, Sean, because I think one thing you could also say about the Del Toro movie is it is synthesizing mainly the book, but with pieces from those other pop culture versions, like the 1931 movie.
Oh yes, yeah, it's very much in conversation with the pop culture notion of Frankenstein. You can tell because it cares about showing how the monster is made, which is not a thing that the novel gives a shit about. Yes, so I mean, any adaptation of Frankenstein in any dimension nowadays has to take into account the incredible pop culture evolution of that work, which started during Mary Shelley's lifetime, which we'll get into some of the notes, but it is a kind of eternal story that is eternally evolving and adapted and modified in various different ways. I, of course, think that the original version is still the best. It's the most potent, most powerful version of this idea, and it's the one that has the most meaning loaded into it to kind of an absurd degree of it's kind of an impossible novel to truly untangle, even though it's so short. But that sort of central animating idea at the core of the novel about creating a life, creating this creature, and what that means for the creature, what that means for humanity, all this kind of stuff. That is such a central premise that is evolved and modified in countless works of fiction since the creation of the original book.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, before we dive into everything here, Sean, I just kind of want to ask, how you, as our resident Francophile, and by that I mean Frankenstein, not France.
Yes.
I think that's a
France.
good joke.
I don't give a shit about France.
Don't the characters in the novel speak French?
I mean, most of the novel takes place around Geneva. But,
so, anyway, I do think that is a thing that is maybe forgotten in adaptation, is that the monster should, if it speaks, be speaking French. That is the language it learns. And yes. I do think the Frankenstein monster would be culturally a very different beast if it were speaking French. It's just a different... It's a language that's harder to make sound scary and monstrous, I think, than English. In any case. So how did you get involved in Frankenstein? What was your initial point of contact? What made you fascinated in the novel? What is it about it that makes you want to do a whole podcast on it, Sean? Because this was your idea.
Yes. That's a big question. I mean, I guess for me, it really starts with childhood because my dad was way into all this stuff. So for me, it starts with the Universal horror movie, the 1931 one, which we're going to talk about, because my dad was a big fan of those movies when he was growing up. And he read the classics illustrated version of Frankenstein and Dracula and all those when he was a kid. And so his love of that stuff got passed on to me. And so I watched a lot of those movies like Frankenstein and Dracula when I was a kid. And then when I got a little bit older, I read a kind of edited version of the novel when I was probably in 5th or 6th grade and really liked it then. And then in high school, I read the actual, like, kind of proper version of the novel. That probably would have been the 1831 edition. And then in college is when I took one of my favorite classes I took was a Gothic horror class from a teacher that specialized in Victorian era literature, and I took a lot of her classes. And there we covered Frankenstein with the text that is the one I reread for this podcast, which is an academic version that has the original 1818 text in it. So I've read the actual novel. This is probably my 4th time reading it all the way through. And I've just always been really attracted to the story. I've always loved the sort of like the Gothic literature. I like the 19th century kind of literary style a lot. And yeah, it really evolved from that love of those early Universal horror monster movies into me kind of discovering the actual book, and then obviously discovering, as with everybody that reads the book, like, oh, this is completely different than every adaptation. Like even adaptations that take a lot from the book, I've yet to see an adaptation that feels like it is like a particularly faithful adaptation of the book. Well, every adaptation takes elements. No adaptation is really doing like the full scope of the book. And so when you read the book, you kind of just see, oh, there's like a whole other dimension to this story, a richness to this story that digs much deeper than any of the adapted forms you will find can really reasonably do. And I think that really generated a lot of my love for it, was seeing that, like, what feels to me like the infinite depths of this novel, where the symbolism and the meaning generated between the relationship between Victor and the creature in the book is so, to use a very Jonathan word, multivalent, right? There's so many different perspectives with which you can analyze and discuss and tease out what is going on in that central relationship. That is what really kind of generated my deep love for the novel and elevated it to me in that kind of like, it is one of the all-time great novels, because that central idea is so incredibly potent, that every time I've read the book, I've gotten something completely different out of it.
It's definitely one of those books that I can imagine if you know, you're someone like you, Sean, who had read it at a young age and kept coming back to it. It's a different book every time, right?
Yes, very much so.
And like, we'll talk about this later when we talk about the Del Toro movie, but Del Toro has been trying to make a Frankenstein movie for decades. And I do think, like, it probably would have been a very different movie at any other point in his life when he'd made it, because your life experience just bounces off of it in a different way, depending on where you are in the world. And it's a hell of a thing. I think, I'll just say up front, if you've never read the actual book, you know, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, you like owe it to yourself. It is such an amazing book. Just the writing itself, the prose itself is like awe-inspiring. It's a beautifully, beautifully written book. And it is, as you were saying, Sean, even if you've seen a bunch of adaptations, none of them, and I don't think any one adaptation could really do what the book is doing, because it's too tied into like the form of a novel. Like, you maybe could do more of it in a TV show format, but even then, I think the book is doing things with, like, its epistolary form that are hard to adapt. And there is just something about it that, like, no matter how pop culturally relevant the idea is, the book is a different thing. And that's pretty unique, I think, among texts that have, like, a clear origin point like this, where in a lot of cases, very little of what Mary Shelley wrote has survived in pop culture consciousness because of which adaptations became dominant in the era of, like, mass image media, which is to say film and TV and everything. And that makes it a pretty fascinating book to go back to, because it's the rare 200-year-old famous novel that you can read and feel like it's brand new, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think, like, a lot of it just comes from, you know, like, Mary Shelley was writing at a time when, like, science fiction was not yet a real genre, right? This is where Frankenstein is often brought up as, like, one of, if not the first science fiction novel, because obviously in the Victorian period is when you have the form of science fiction really becomes a thing with authors like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And so, you know, I think with the genre of science fiction, a real interest in that genre is in, like, the process of the thing. And so that's why you get in these adaptations, there's such interest in the process of creating the creature and what does that look like. And that becomes kind of the whole story in adaptation. in a way that, like in the novel, it's just a couple of pages, and it's almost, the details are completely elided. Like, Mary Shelley's not interested in describing how the monster is made. She's interested in what happens because it is made.
That's by far the most surprising thing to me, reading the book, was like, I had no idea about that. I was reading interviews with various people who worked on the Del Toro movie, who read the book for the first time to work on the movie, who said that, who were like, I had no idea. And it's I mean, and specifically how she gets away with it. This is the thing that's impossible to adapt in a film medium, is Victor Frankenstein is narrating the story. So he says, I'm not going to tell you how I did this because I don't want you to know how I did this, and elides it. And I agree. I actually think I would question whether you could call this book science fiction. Like, I think it's so much more of a, like, philosophical, almost fantastical, because he could be doing it with magic for all we know. That's not, like, the focus of the book. And it is fascinating to go back to and be like, oh, the thing everyone has latched onto for 200 fucking years is the thing she was least interested in this novel. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and I just think it's funny because you do have, obviously it gets lumped in with lots of other Victorian sort of like Gothic horror novels, most notably Dracula. And, you know, Dracula has a sort of related problem with its adaptations, which is that Dracula adaptations, we talked about this, I talked about the Nosferatu movie from last year, that sort of is a loose adaptation of the novel Dracula, that there is a hyper emphasis on the opening section of Dracula where Jonathan Harker goes to Castle Dracula and meets Dracula and all that. And that's like the spine of most of the Dracula story that people know. It's the biggest part of like the most famous movie, the 1931 movie with Bela Lugosi. And like there's such a huge emphasis on that part of the book that it becomes overemphasized in adaptations, and most adaptations of Dracula never get to the actual plot of the novel, which involves Dracula coming to London, and all the stuff that happens there. But the thing that's different with that is that at least that part of the book that is hyper emphasized is a part of the book. like it is a big notable part of the novel. And so for other similar kinds of novels that have this thing that got a like sort of popular adaptation in the early film era, almost all of them adapted from popular stage versions that had already been done. Like, those are taking like the concentrated popular sections of the novel and expanding them out. But Frankenstein is the only one I know of where that is basically done for a thing that is barely even in the actual novel, which is just something that's so fascinating about it. It's not over-exaggerating a notable section of the book because it's everyone's favorite part. It is like taking a germ of an idea that's in the book and turning that into the entire story.
Yeah, and again, it is such a novel. Like, I've spent a lot of time this week thinking about this. Like, if you were to make a Frankenstein movie or TV show or whatever that put the same kind of emphasis Shelley did, how would you do it in a filmic form? And I do think it's a tricky question because, like, the idea of animating life is so visual, you want to visualize it. But she specifically does it. But, like, how do you would have to be narrating it in some kind of, I really don't know how you would in a filmic medium. And it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things about the novel is that it is so taking advantage of what literature can do, because I think another problem with adaptations is that the monster becomes overly concrete and overly physical, where in the book it is like he has he is obviously clearly a physical character and all that kind of stuff, but he has an ethereal presence to him because of the way that he's deployed through Victor's POV. And the ways in which, the very kind of romantic era ideas of Victor out in nature climbing the fucking mountains, and then that's where he sees the creature like duck behind a rock and is chasing him, and then it has this whole like huge conversation with him in an ice cave hidden away in the Alps or whatever. There's this way in which there is this supernatural mystical component that the creature takes on in the book because he exists around the fringes, because he exists in this very romanticized worldview and style, that the movies really struggle to replicate anything with that, or they don't even really try to, because I think like movies make the creature so physical, so concrete, so tangible, whereas I think he flits in and out of that sensibility in the book. That there are times when he's narrating his own story that the creature feels very real. There are times where he feels very spectral, and almost like a figment of Frankenstein's madness. And so there are lots of elements like that where the abstraction of the novel form, the nature of like the unreliable narrator component of it being in a epistolary novel that's being related to us by as like kind of observer or a third person narrator with the ship's captain. Like all that removes you from the direct contact of the content of the story. That helps you invent the details and build the kind of gothic imagination of the book, which is the style of the time. That is just something that's so literary that no film adaptation can really do anything with it, because it's like you have to go so stylistically extreme to try to replicate it. You'd have to make a weird like avant-garde movie that is very alienating to a mainstream audience if you were to try to do something that so fractures the viewpoint and moves everything into the realm of like questioning the reality of the world you're seeing, which I think the novel's inviting you to do, to question who is Frankenstein, what is his sanity, are these things he's relating to you real, are they made up? Like those kinds of things are meant to be active questions that the reader is engaging with while they're reading the novel, in a way that movies struggle to have that level of ambiguity to them.
Right, because like, for instance, in the Del Toro movie is very faithful to the kind of nesting doll structure of the book, of the captain, then Frankenstein, then the monster, right? And then coming back out on that. But like when you do that in a movie and you have Frankenstein on the ship narrating to the captain, when he starts talking and we cut, the language of film tells us we're seeing what happened.
Yes.
When it's a book and he's talking, the language of the novel is, okay, this guy could be bullshitting us. This guy could be very self-serving in what he's saying, which Victor Frankenstein is very self-serving in how he talks about himself. And like, that's a constant thing that, and I'm not describing a failing of the Del Toro movie. This is just a way film works, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's just a feature of the style of the novel that is, of the style of its time. Epistolary novels were incredibly popular in Frankenstein in this period, in the Victorian period, because of course this is what people actually did. They actually wrote long, elaborate letters to people. So it's almost like the found film genre of its day. It's replicating, it's creating a verisimilitude by replicating an actual written form that people really engage with to communicate with each other. But that creates that level of ambiguity of like, you are able to see through the cracks of the story that Victor is telling you to see into the kind of person that Victor is, because Victor's not really going to tell you that because he doesn't have the level of self-reflection to do that. But that's like a thing that, again, like movies have to find other ways to try to do it, or just not do it at all. Like the James Whale movie, in most adaptations, just don't even really concern themselves with trying to replicate that idea.
Right. Fascinating stuff. I say we got to bring back epistolary novels. It's such a cool form. It's so good. I always love going back and reading a good... I mean, this is like the best one, but you know what I mean. They're fun.
Yes. I think the only problem with them is that, like, they would have to be written as, like, an email or something, and yes, it would just be terrible, and you'd have, like, someone's, like, grown-worthy email signature that they wrote when they were, like, 18 and forgot is still there, and it's just there at the end of every single part. And, of course, those kinds of books do exist. There are the modern versions of epistolary novels, but it's one of the things that's fun about this time is that, like, literature and your ability to write and all that stuff was so privileged that like the style of it is so beautiful and so gorgeous that it's just kind of a lost art form that people can't really write like this anymore, because they wrote all the fucking time, and they're writing letters, they're writing long elaborate diary entries, all that kind of stuff, and it just gives birth to this very, very beautiful style of prose that just can't be replicated anymore.
Well, maybe with ChatGPT, we'll get there again, Sean.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what Mary Shelley was thinking. It was just like, oh, one day they'll make an AI, and that will finally be able to do right by what I'm doing here.
If you transported any of the like great English novelists, Mary Shelley, Jane Austen, any of these people to today, and showed them the way people are using like AI, how quickly would they want to kill themselves to get out of this reality?
I think they'd want to go back to their own time. They're like, it's like flushing toilets. That's nice. I'll go back. Yeah, it would not be worth the trade-off. All right, we're stalling. Let's move on, Sean. You put on some history for the novel here, so why don't we have a history lesson? Yeah. So this is just a little bit of like the history of Mary Shelley to kind of lead us into a deeper discussion on the book. I tried to avoid making this too big because it's the topic of the history of Frankenstein. There's an easy way you can do the history of this, and I'm like trying to explain what the Enlightenment is and what the Romanticism is, because it's such a central novel to a lot of that stuff, and it's so in conversation with literary movements at the time. We can talk about some of that stuff, but I didn't put together a crazy notes list. But I do think Mary Shelley's history and the kind of lead up to this novel is so fascinating that if you don't know this story, it's well worth getting this kind of brief primer on. So, where this all starts, we have Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. That is what her birth name was, for better known now as Mary Shelley, but she was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. The author of Frankenstein, she was born in August 1797 to her father, William Godwin, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, people might know those names because both her parents were very, very important figures during the Enlightenment in Britain, which is your, 18th century political, philosophical, literary movement around the Age of Reason, developing the ideas of science / natural philosophy, and, thinking about the ways in which humans have rights and all that kind of stuff. It's the birth of everything we love in the world, like capitalism. It all comes here. Her father, William Godwin, was a political radical and an author and novelist, and he did a lot of stuff. He was one of the early proponents of political anarchism. In his work in Inquiry Concerning Political Justice was a major political text of the Revolutionary period at the end of the 18th century. So he's like a major political writer and a novel writer who has a lot of very influential political ideas at that time. Her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, who was one of the earliest feminist philosophers, and her most famous work being A Vindication of the Rights of Women, serving as a foundation for what we consider to be feminism and women's rights activism. So her two parents are huge. It's like two huge figures. She comes from a very interesting family. Wollstonecraft and Godwin were not married for very long when Wollstonecraft tragically died from complications of the birth of Mary Shelley. Days after the birth, she died, and her father remarried when Mary was 4. So Mary Wollstonecraft was not really a part of Mary Shelley's life when she was growing up, which is a thing that obviously echoes through elements of Frankenstein. Being raised by her father Godwin and her stepmother, Mary's childhood was highly unusual. She was heavily educated by her father, far more so than was usual for a woman living at this period of time in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And her connection to her father, who is famous in literary and political circles, exposed her to many of the remarkable people in Britain at the time. So she met basically everybody from this period, but the most obviously notable one is Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet who would later be her husband. Mary and Percy started a romantic relationship when she was 16 and he was 21. When her father discovered the relationship, he disapproved, and this formed a crack in Mary's relationship with her father. One weird detail about this relationship is that they would meet in secret in the graveyard where Mary Wollstonecraft's grave was. And so there's, it's a very appropriate romantic gothic relationship. It's a whole thing.
Mary Shelley's life is it feels like someone wrote it as a book.
Yes.
That's the thing about her, who her parents were, what experiences she had. And it is the kind of thing where any book printing of Frankenstein needs to have an intro telling you about her life story, because it is just so relevant to what the book is. It really, it's I don't think that's always true of you need to know about the author. There's something about knowing about Mary Shelley's life that makes the book just so present tense, if that makes sense,
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just a sense of you read her history, they're she was the fucking chosen one or some shit.
Yes.
There's it's all the coincidences convoluting around this one person that she's connected to so many important literary and political figures of her time, and this chosen child of one of the major political writers on the male side and the female side coming together in this child. It's just fucking crazy. Anyways, Mary and Percy Shelley, they eloped to travel across Europe in 1814, along with Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. Note that at this point, Percy Shelley was married to another woman. There's a whole, all this shit is super complicated. All these people were fucking each other. It was wild. We have this idea of it's olden times, so they were very proper. No, they were fucking hippies. They were hippies before hippies. Lots of free love, lots of fucking going on. It's a very convoluted relationship tree if you're trying to mark all this shit out. In 1815, Mary gave birth to her first child, but sadly that child died 2 weeks after its birth. In 1816, Mary gave birth to her second child, her son William, and she and Percy went on another trip across Europe, and during this trip, they visited Percy's good friend, one Lord Byron, who had also, one of the reasons for around this trip is that Lord Byron had gotten Mary's sister Claire Clairmont pregnant in an earlier affair. So again, all these people were fucking each other. And so they met with Lord Byron at his chateau in Geneva, along with another Romantic era writer who's notable named John William Polidori. It's during this time that this very, very famous event happened that is like the germ of what becomes Frankenstein. So there was this meeting they had at Lake Geneva, which became the seed that spawned Frankenstein. It is the summer of 1816. So if you want another detail that makes this feel like it's fucking like this weird fated story, the summer of 1816 is known as the summer that never happened because it was a bizarrely rainy, cold summer, constantly overcast because there was a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in Asia. I didn't write down what the country was. But this massive volcanic eruption that basically blanketed the world in darkness. This is what inspired Lord Byron's poem, The Darkness, which is a great poem. If you want to read it, it's fantastic. It's very gorgeous. And that just dramatically altered the climate for that year and years to follow. But this is the summer when she writes Frankenstein is the summer that never happened, where the world is blanketed in darkness from the fucking volcanic eruption. So, again, it's crazy. These four writers were sitting around a fire at Byron's villa on the lake when they began telling each other ghost stories. Lord Byron proposed that they each tell their own story, or like basically create their own story. And Mary slowly then, with that kind of notion, began developing over that summer the story that became Frankenstein. Incidentally, all these people ended up writing something from this event. The other most notable one is Polidori, the other writer that was there. He would write the novel called The Vampire, which is arguably the origin of the modern literary vampire. So this very fateful meeting between four very major literary figures, well, three of them who are already major literary figures. Again, Mary Shelley is like 18 or 19 at this point, so she has not like written any novels. This is her first novel she ever wrote. But she's obviously, maybe the smartest of all the people there. She just happened to be the youngest as well. Part of the basis of the novel were experiments that had been conducted near the end of the 18th century, most famously by Luigi Galvani, on the effect of electricity on the nervous system. So Mary Shelley, obviously being very educated and well-read, she was very aware of like what was happening in the world of science/natural philosophy at the time. And there were lots of these experiments about how if you pass electrical current through the nervous system of, for instance, a dead frog, that its legs would start kicking. So there is these ideas of like the spirit existing as a like thing that could be understood and dissected and studied from it as a scientific method point of view. And just as an interesting note, these experiments are where we get the modern word galvanize from, comes from Galvani's last name. So that's where this term, this idea all comes from. So she's building on a lot of very popular ideas happening around her in this period to kind of come up with this notion of this corpse being resurrected by some sort of power.
Well, and this is also just something I wanted to note that I think is interesting, that virtually every Frankenstein adaptation is also dealing with, like, the meta text around this stuff, right?
Yes.
Because none of that is in the book. The Galvani stuff, the electricity, that's not how it's described, right? But, of course, knowing that that was a thing in the period that was on Shelley's mind is part of the reason why electricity is used in all the Frankenstein adaptations as part of the method, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it becomes this sort of like it's the fire of God, that lights the soul in this body. Yes, and as you say, in the novel, it is not described because he doesn't describe how he does it. But it's certainly not he has a giant tower that a lightning bolt strikes or whatever.
Yes.
It's definitely not that because he makes the monster in his like apartment he's renting as a student in university, which is like 1,000 times better. I really wish that adaptations would do that shit more. And it's like this weird, like in some drawing room somewhere, he's just got like this fucking dissected body laying out there.
I'm imagining like Sean, our like apartment we lived in college, and you just had a fucking dead body in your room that you were experimenting on, when you came home from school. That'd be killer. That'd be great.
Yeah. So that you just knock on my door and I just open it just a crack, just like, what is it? What do you need? I'm busy. Leave me to my work, you fool. And then slam the door on you. Yes. Maybe that was happening. You just never noticed.
I mean, in today's context, I would just assume you had a meth lab in there. If it was college and I just opened it, leave me to my work, I would not go straight to Frankenstein, but there we go.
Yes. Anyways, back to the history. Mary would write the novel Frankenstein over the course of the next year and a half, so it took her a long time to kind of craft the full novel. Again, this was the first novel that she wrote. At this point, her now husband, Percy Shelley. So keep in mind that during all that shit, she and Percy Shelley were not yet married. Percy Shelley had a child by the other wife that he had, and all the shit. Like, their lives are fucking crazy. But after that summer in Geneva is when they do get married. Percy Shelley is basically an editor on Frankenstein. This is where there's maybe like a little side note of that there's a long academic tradition, and you can see the shadows of this in how the movie for the 1931 one is credited, where people kind of de-emphasize Mary Shelley's role in her creating the novel, and there was lots of academic work being like, but Percy Shelley was the real architect of Frankenstein, and that has all been debunked if anyone has like heard those kinds of ideas. Percy Shelley obviously had an influence on the novel, as you know, the family and friends of any novelist have an influence on the novels that they write, and he had a regular kind of editorial role, but he did not write the book. He did not come up with like the ideas for the book. It is Mary Shelley's book. He served as an editor. So that is like what that relationship was, as people have like heard like the crazy theories, kind of like, oh, Shakespeare didn't write the real, you know, it's people love that kind of shit. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein.
Well, and in this case, it's a little different than Shakespeare because it's specifically about the misogyny of assuming
Yes.
a woman couldn't do it. Yeah. Well, although in Shakespeare, there's the classism element of a poor, a middle-class person can... Yeah, you know what? It's all bad. It's all bad. Conspiracy theories are dumb. And, fuck all that shit.
Yes, it turns out Mary Shelley did, in fact, write Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The novel was published in 1818. The novel enjoyed immediate success and was quickly adapted to the theater with the play Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, in 1823, which is a thing we should bring back. We should bring back things having two titles, because just to be clear, Frankenstein itself does. It is Frankenstein, semicolon, or comma, the modern Prometheus. This was a common stylistic thing at the time, like Moby Dick or The Whale. And I think we should bring it back. We should just give everything two titles with an or in the middle, because that was just cool. Incidentally, this play, Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein, this is a really important adaptation because this is where you get some of the tropes around focusing more on the creation of the thing. Because a lot of what we talked about earlier about the difficulties in adapting it to film also exists in adapting it to theater, where now you have to have it like physically shown on screen. And so that's where you get more of the process. That's where you get Fritz, who is the Victor Frankenstein's like weird assistant character that now is known in popular media as Igor. He was originally called Fritz. He's called Fritz in the 1931 film as well. That's a later thing that he gets turned into Igor. This is also where you get things like the line, it's alive, it's alive. That comes from Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein. So it's very quick. It's just in the first 5 years after the novel is published that you're already getting that sense of people taking the idea of the novel and starting to spin with it in different directions. Mary Shelley would further edit and revise Frankenstein for a later edition in 1831. That 1831 edition is what is generally published today. If you've read the novel and you don't know which edition you read, it's probably the 1831 one. Today, we have specifically chosen to read the original 1818 version, not out of a strong preference, purely out of that is just, I reached over and was like, what? Which one was it again? That was mine. And I picked it up as like the original 1818 text. And I said, Jonathan, well, we'll do the 1818 one because I don't want to find a different book to read.
Well, and as I was looking for versions of it, I noticed that a lot of recent, like, good printings, like actual, like, mine is the Penguin Classics version, those are reverting to and the version I had even had a note on this, that there's, I guess, in academia, more interest today in the 1818 version, and so there's some academic preference has moved back towards that one, and so you would have an easier time finding a copy of that today than maybe 10 or 20 years ago.
Yes, absolutely, because, yes, that was like, when I took that class, that was part of it. Of like, oh, we're going to do the original version. There is an academic interest in going back to that original one. Now, if you read the 1831 one, that's not a big deal. They are broadly the same novel in the sense of like the differences are more subtle. They're more in the details. There's not any like major plot diversions or anything like that. The main sort of like, and I've never actually like sat down and read both of them side by side to compare them directly, but what people talk about the primary differences are is that Mary Shelley inserts more in the 1831 one, where at that point she has gone through a lot more major deaths in her life. Percy Shelley has died by that point. That she inserts this kind of notion of fate or destiny and a kind of more divine element into the novel that Victor maybe has less a sense of free will. And that's kind of what people mostly note as like the primary kind of shift in the novel, is kind of a tonal one. But there's not like in this one version, the Frankenstein strangles William, and this one he doesn't. You know, there's not like big plot diversions. So whichever version you read, I think you'll be able to participate just fine in the conversation we're having today.
I do just want to say, I know William is a very common name. Fucking wild that her son is named William, and what happens to a kid named William in this book. Just fucking wild.
Yep.
Yeah. I wonder if William grew up and read that. I was like, Mom, why What the hell? Anyway.
It was like, well, look, I was just trying to come up with a name, and I looked around and I was like, William, whatever. And then William gets horribly murdered by the giant monster. Just strangled to death.
Anyway, so do you want to pause here and talk about the book now that we've done the history?
Yes. So where do we want to... How do we want to tackle this discussion? Because obviously the novel is could be its own series of podcasts, let alone its own podcast.
Yes.
So we obviously can't do an insane deep dive on it because we've got other stuff to talk about. What's like the main thing that for you, Jonathan, as someone who read it for the first time, what's like the kind of central thing that really jumped out to you about the book?
I mean, the number one thing that jumped out to me about it is I think it's just stunningly beautifully written. And I was highlighting, I read all my stuff on Kindle so I can do my highlights and then bring them up on my computer and whatnot. And I have an unhelpful number of highlights, like that number of highlights where it's like, this doesn't actually help me because I have so many quotes that I couldn't possibly begin to identify which ones I see as more important. And I think what's so interesting is you combine that with the nested structure of the book where you have the literal letters of Captain Walton that are written more like, your typical epistolary, this is someone writing to someone else. Then you have the account of Victor Frankenstein, which is a recording of him talking to Walton. And then you have the monster talking to Frankenstein, talking to Walton. And it's not that she even does big shifts in style between those three, but I think because they're subtle actually makes it more powerful. Like the way you go from the voice of the captain to the voice of Victor Frankenstein to the voice of the monster, and then you come back out. That's the other thing, is it's a nesting doll that reconstructs by the end, and I think is so fascinating. And just, the prose is beautiful. It is full of stunning human insight, amazing descriptions of images and places and all of that stuff. There's definitely a version of Frankenstein you could make that is more like a Terrence Malick movie, that is people wandering the countryside, and there's maybe narration in the background, but it's much more oblique in its narration. And that would be, or in its narrative, and that would be fully faithful to the style of her novel in some ways, because of how sensory it is. But I also think, it is so interesting to see the character of Victor come across through... in between the lines. He is someone you come to kind of hate and pity in some ways, but he also has some noble qualities. But he is so, especially in the last half of the novel, once you've had the monster's point of view, he is so self-serving in how he talks about all his trials and tribulations. And I think the best section of the book is the monsters section, where, it feels like the most unencumbered, personal narrative where someone isn't advancing an agenda in how they're talking, although the monster is to some degree because they're trying to get something out of Frankenstein in that conversation. So I know I'm rambling here, but I think it is the command of language, and obviously the structure matters a lot too, but I do think it is number one with a bullet to me is just the sheer command of language in this thing is extraordinary.
I mean, yes, absolutely. The verbiage is so powerful, and in that that sense of the description of the natural world, right, which is very much a part of the Romantic movement, right, because this novel being a central novel of the Romantic movement is part of this idea of not sort of countering the Age of Reason or Enlightenment, but sort of saying that doesn't explain everything, right? And so the Romantics really have this sort of interest in the natural world and the unseen world that exists in nature, and that sense of where Victor has all these very powerful moments where he is kind of removed from society and is out in nature. And you get that incredible description of him going up and hiking the mountains and all that stuff that leads to him communing with the monster in the ice cave, which is just such a great image. I just love that section of the book so much. But you get a lot of that kind of stuff of Victor out in the world, sort of contemplating himself and exploring the world, and getting kind of lost in it, and him trying to find himself in these sort of broken pieces that he has, which is fantastic. And then yes, that structure of the novel, which is so fantastic, where one sort of central theme of the book obviously is the difference between what something is on the outside and what it is on the inside, right? Which is most potently felt in the creature, where it has this, horrifying, grotesque exterior that makes everybody hate it upon just a merest glimpse of the thing. But on the inside, he is the most beautiful, most eloquent character in the book. Like, if there's one place where Mary Shelley does shift the style of the narrative voice, it's for the creature. Like, I think the ship's captain in Frankenstein, like, they talk in a very similar, relate things in a very similar way. That can maybe be partially excused by the captain translating Victor to a certain extent. Because one place where you get Victor's words very directly is when he has a huge speech near the end of the book of him saying to them, like, no, you can't go back. You must go on. You must keep going to the North Pole. You must not relent. And there he's very different feeling. But the monster has this almost Shakespearean style eloquence to the way that he speaks that is so gorgeous and so beautiful. And just kind of, I think, gives you this access to this very pure-hearted, good, gentle being that is so wounded and so hurt by a world that just outright rejects it for no good reason, just based on its ugly exterior, that it turns it into this creature, this monster that ends up killing, innocent people that have no party directly to what the creature has been doing, but the creature must find some way to inflict pain on the world that has made it and on Victor directly. And so that's why it chooses the path it's chosen. But there's a way in which that structure of the novel kind of reflects some of those ideas as well, that you're digging away from this exterior down into this like sort of pure core of what is this monster, this childlike creature, this amazing creature underneath everything that is at the kind of midpoint of the novel where you get that big, long section, and then you start coming out of it, and at first Victor is like kind of convinced, and then the more he's away from the monster, the more he drifts back to, no, it's evil, no, I cannot possibly make another one, and ultimately he makes his fateful choice of destroying the bride that he was going to make for the monster. But yeah, like that element of the novel is, I think, very, very profound.
Totally. And that's another thing that, like, because there are most movie versions go more in the Karloff direction of having the monster be even just using the term monster, right?
Yeah.
There are films like the Del Toro one, like the Kenneth Branagh one with Robert De Niro, that go for the eloquence of the monster. And I think the Del Toro one does that beautifully. But I also think I don't think you can match what Mary Shelley does on the page in film. Yes. When the monster is something that you have to physically show. Because of exactly what you're talking about, Sean. Because we get access through his speech to the inner life of the monster in a way that film can get to interiority in all sorts of ways, but the exterior is always there to some degree. But in a book, you can totally efface the exterior because we don't see him. And even the descriptions that Victor gives us are very, as you were saying earlier, Sean, spectral, ethereal. We're not sure how accurate they even are. And so we just get the soul of this being through the words. And that is something where I think like you could make a really killer radio play of Frankenstein that would get this really beautifully. But I think a film, there is a limit to just like the sheer eloquence of the creature and the gentleness of the spirit is tough to communicate. I think Del Toro comes close, and it's the kind of thing Del Toro is very good at because he loves monsters and he loves doing this. But it's a thing in translation that is tough to do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And because part of it is tough to do because of the visual element of it. The other thing that's tough to do is that, like, you just can't match Mary Shelley's writing, but also her writing is so verbose, it is hard to actually incorporate into a script. Is one thing that makes it hard for, like, compared to, like, when we did our Great Gatsby one, where we read a bunch of quotes from Great Gatsby. That's very easy because you get lots of, like, short sections of writing that you can kind of pick out. For Mary Shelley's writing, it's hard to get, like, here's just one little piece that's really good. It's like, look at this whole like masterful speech that's like 3 pages long. Like his whole thing at the end when he encounters the creatures with the ship's captain and he gives his kind of last big speech in the book. It's like you can't do that entire thing in a movie version because it'd be like 15 minutes of just him talking.
Yes.
But the language is so beautiful, and taking any of it out kind of mars the whole thing. So it's like, I think that's another thing that movies struggle with, is that it's hard to incorporate Mary Shelley's language very directly into the film compared to other novels, that you can do that much more easily. And so I do think that that's something that a lot, like, I know the Del Toro, it's like one of my things that felt a little bit lacking, is I think sometimes the dialogue in that movie struggles to try to actually find the voice of the style of the time. But I think it's partially because it's just so hard to incorporate in a visual medium like that.
It is, definitely. And, like with the monster, there's a whole section where he just starts listing all the books he read and goes into them. And it's like a book report. It's pages long, talking about and Del Toro does actually do this to us. He does a abbreviated version of it, listing some of the books. And I like how that's written. But it's a place where, like, Del Toro couldn't use the quote in the book because it's pages and pages long. Yeah. You have to rewrite it. It is a genuine challenge. Although also I think maybe something that actually is helpful to adaptation, because I think one of the things that can kill Great Gatsby adaptations we talked about is the temptation to just use the text of the book unaltered when, like, it's a different medium. You gotta shift things up.
Yeah, but either way, with Shelley's writing, and particularly she puts it into overdrive for the creature. It is very, very gorgeous.
Yeah.
But on this idea of, like, the interior versus the exterior, and all that kind of stuff, the thing that for me on this reading that really jumped out to me and I was very fixated on was the ways in which Victor and the monster mirror each other, or the monster mirrors Victor, in this kind of, in your kind of psychoanalysis way, right? If you're looking at the monster as a version of the id, a version of the subconscious, that there's this way in which Victor too experiences this kind of problem. Like one of the things I was really fixated on was, if you're, to use our modern language, like looking at Victor as a neurodivergent character, but looking at him in the context of the time where he's described in this very Byronic hero kind of way as this man with a nervous disposition who's susceptible to big mood swings, big fits of manic behavior, and then these deep, dark depressions that are, for most of the novel, are motivated by things the monster has done. But if you're looking at that as a metaphorical expression, you are seeing this man who's struggling with trying to fit in this world, who is given to these moments of, again, like extreme manic behavior that everyone around him is confused by, or these fits of incredible depression where he just slinks away into himself, and he describes these, like, months go by and he hasn't done anything, like the section where he's in the prison after Clerval's death. And there's just this, I think, very powerful way of looking at Victor as this guy who just can't fit in the world that he lives in, because he too experiences this problem where his family, Elizabeth, Clerval, see this one person on the outside, see this amazing Victor Frankenstein, their beloved friend and family member that they love and care for, but that there is something else inside that is different and that they really struggle with. And I think it's very interesting when you get these sort of, like, letters from Elizabeth, letters from his father, and you get, like, the text from those characters directly, that is them writing letters to Victor. And you see the way in which they're trying to understand his behavior, trying to figure out, like, what is wrong with you? Like, what's going on? Like, do you just need to come home? Do you need to go out into nature? Like, how do you kind of fix, like, whatever is kind of, like, going on with your mood and your emotional state and all the stuff? And Victor can't express it to them. Again, like, through the literal text, he can't express it because the monster, he feels guilt around what the monster's doing. He feels he can't expose the monster to the world. But of course, if you're reading it in that metaphorical light, it is he cannot express these things and these feelings that he has. And so he has the kind of, like, inverse problem of the monster, where people see one thing on the outside and assume certain things about him and build a relationship with him based on those assumptions. But there is, like, a person underneath that who has this very turbulent, chaotic, emotional and mental life, partially from his inability to process the grief of his mother, that nobody can get access to, and he can't express it to them. And the only way it comes out is through the monster that is that problem made manifest. That is this thing that is so deformed on the outside, even though it does have a very pure heart that wants to be loved, that nobody can ever get to it. Nobody can ever form that relationship to it. Like, he is, as he describes at the end, he is more alone than Satan himself. He's like, even the fallen angel had more companions than I have. And so the monster is this, like, extreme version of this problem, this idea of, I want or need something in this world that can be like me, that can understand me, and I cannot find it, and I cannot get it, no matter what. And Victor's in the exact same boat, that he doesn't actually have a relationship with anybody that actually accesses who he really is underneath it. And that's why he is also essentially alone.
Absolutely. And it is so interesting to me that, like, obviously this book is, like, really amenable to psychoanalytic readings. It's very amenable to, and as you see in the Del Toro movie, it's very amenable to that and to, like, various religious readings as well. Even though that stuff isn't, like, in a literal sense in the book, in part because psychoanalysis, Freud hadn't been born yet when this was written, yes. Right? So this predates all of our language for that kind of thing. But it is there. And as you were saying, like, the easy way you can kind of, like, code this is that the monster is, the creature is monstrous on the outside, but very human inside. And Victor is this person who has an air of humanity about him outside, but inside feels detached from humanity, right? And I agree that, like, that is... And I, on this first, so this was my first reading, obviously, of the book. And for me, like, I think part of my reaction was, like, how horrible Victor is in so many parts of the book. Particularly the part that is, like, the most horrifying thing that happens in the novel is the death of William, and then Justine, who is their cousin who lives with them, who is framed for it, and Victor doesn't speak up to try to get this to stop, and she is executed, and this sends him into one of his depressions, obviously, and it's a horrible, monstrous, like, act that happens. But I also think there is, like, this sense of this. I like how you put that, Sean, of, like, we can almost read him through a neurodivergent lens or something like that, and that there is something, like, broken in this person that society is not amenable to, and the series of horrors that, you know, weigh and weigh and weigh on this person until the end when he finally unburdens himself to the captain, Captain Walton, is, like, this very empathetic arc, even though Victor is often, I think, a very unsympathetic character in how he comports himself.
Yeah, but you're, like, I think you're given to some amount of sympathy for him just because you're getting his story. You're seeing how much he's suffering, even if his suffering is causing all this horrible shit to happen, you know, and he makes that awful, tragic choice to not give the monster its companion. Which obviously is a thing that then leads to further death and further mayhem for no reason that the audience, I think, that any, like, reasonable reader would agree with. That's like this risk of, oh, I will make another fiend like him. It's like, but he's, like, the only reason he's doing any of the shit that is bad is because of the way the world has treated him. If he has this companion, there's at least a hope that he can go and build a life in, like, a happy life somewhere, but you can't even give him that. But you do, I think, see the ways in which, like, Victor is so just destroyed by everything that happens around him. And there is just all this very coded language about, like, describing him, again, having, like, a nervous disposition, things like that, these, like, fits of depression that at the period of the time is what we would now interpret as someone who has some sort of, like, bipolar disorder or is potentially on the autistic spectrum, right? Like, it's this period in, like, British history and, like, Western history, broadly speaking, is one in which there is this deep fascination with the unseen elements of the mind. And it's like, it's the thing the Victorians were most interested in. It's the thing they were most fascinated by, was this unseen world of emotions and the supernatural, and superstitions and the sexual as well, right? Like, that on the outside, that's this very repressed society, but in reality, like, that repression is another form of the obsession they have with the things they're repressing. That because it's a society that's so about being proper, it's so about reason and logic, and all these things, and it's also about, like, you know, being faithful and pure and in your marriage and all those kinds of things, that restrictive element also means that all the attention is constantly being put on the things that they're restricting, right? And this is, like, I'm basically channeling, this is Foucault's argument on the history of sexuality, that it's like, there's no period in Western history that is more interested and more fixated on sex than the Victorian period, because they're so interested in repressing and controlling these things. And it's true of the psyche as well. And it's where you get people like a Sigmund Freud near the end of this period being informed by all this thinking and all this interest in, like, the mind and the subconscious and dreams and all these things, that are getting a much higher level of like sort of introspection that society is engaging in. And Mary Shelley is at like the beginning of this historical movement. And so that's where I think you get this like real interest in what is making this guy tick and how does it work. And it's in some ways a response to a lot of the writing of people like Lord Byron, who creates that Byronic hero figure that I think you can basically put Victor into. But I think Mary Shelley's even more critical of that figure and its kind of effect on the people around them, partially because she is not Lord Byron. She is someone who spent time with Lord Byron and saw the effect that Lord Byron had on the people around him, like her stepsister. But there is this sense of like this interest in what makes these strange people who just don't seem to fit into society, that behave in ways that you can't really comprehend, that you're trying to reach out to, what makes them tick, like why are they behaving that way? How can we help them? But also how are they kind of destroying themselves and the people around them? And Victor is just such a central character and such a beautiful and fascinating character at the beginning of that kind of whole literary movement, digging into these exact questions.
Totally. And it's another case where I think the character becomes very hard to render on screen, because I think that you again always have to make things just a little more concrete on screen. Yeah. And like, I really, really like Oscar Isaac and the Del Toro interpretation, but they go in a fairly dark direction with like and I think everything they pull is there in the book in terms of the narcissism and the way he hurts people and all of that stuff. But I could also see pulling that in, but also pulling in some of the other stuff to make a more sympathetic creation of the character. There's also like the mad scientist archetype that you get in the 1931 movie that I think is pretty detached from what the book is actually doing. But my favorite quote in the entire book, Sean, shows up pretty early. It's in the Captain Walton letters. And I highlighted this and I kept thinking on it. And as great as the rest of the book is, this continued to be my favorite paragraph in the novel. And I think because of this conversation we're having right now about Victor, it kind of explains why, because I think it is to some degree the thesis of what the whole book is, and I just think it's beautiful. So again, this is in the last part of the prelude before you get into the chapter structure, and it is Captain Walton describing Victor Frankenstein, and he says, "Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature. The starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seem still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments, yet when he has retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures." I love that. I don't think it's just a great description of Frankenstein and the things we're talking about. It's like one of the statements you can make about so many great like artists. It's such an amazing like way of putting that idea. And it's a quote I just kept coming back to reading this.
Well, it's because it's part of what's really powerful about the framing device is that it all comes in with Walton talking to his sister, writing to his sister about how he wants a friend, he himself wants a companion, that he feels lonely in the world, and then he stumbles upon Victor, and Walton is the person in Victor's life that seems to have the greatest level of insight into who he is and what's happening with him. And it's so tragic that this happens too late, right? It happens at the end of Victor's life after all this stuff has happened, that he meets someone that is able to look at Victor and describe him as having this double existence, that he has these multiple sides of who he is, that he is someone with this kind of like untempered soul, but then there's something frightening about that, but there's also something beautiful about it as well. And that Elizabeth and nobody in Victor's family really understands that about him. Certainly like Clerval, like they all think that Victor is someone that's like quote unquote normal. And they're just like, and there's just like, he just needs to get over it. Like he just needs to go back home for a summer and then he'll be fine. It's a much more mild version of the like, well, we've just got to give him some shock treatment and then he will get over his depression, which is shit that's happening at this period in time. But there's this just sense of like this feeling of if he just modulates this a little bit, he'll be fine and everything will get back to normal. And Walton is someone who kind of sees that like, that's not really what's going on here. This isn't someone having a temporary mood. It is someone that this is part of who they are, how they experience themselves and how they experience the world. And he tries to approach that with some kind of real understanding, even if that understanding comes too late. But it's part of that whole theme in the novel about companionship, about understanding that humanity desperately wants, that goes back to Paradise Lost and Adam and Eve and all that stuff. But yes, like that passage, I'm glad you read it out, is one of the most beautiful and one of the best at setting up this whole idea that is one of the kind of like central, I think, kind of like decoding elements that you can like use this and pull you that through the novel to give clarity to what's going on with Victor. Because part of the difficulty of this sort of novel, an epistolary novel, is you're so much in the character's POV that you need to give the audience some decoding tools to be able to see beyond just what that POV is telling you. And that's one of those passages I think does that sets you up to see Victor in a certain kind of way that lets you see beyond the basic thing that he's telling you and kind of try to peek back into like, but what is he feeling or what's like happening beyond that way he's just telling you. Because Victor is a person that there are some things that he is introspective on and he reflects in his story, but there are lots of really important things that happen that he does not in his narration reflect on or give much like oxygen to, even though they are like really central ideas to what's happening to him.
Well, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, like, all of the people in Victor's life, and basically all of them die by the end of the book. They all die horrible deaths. I think the only one left is his little brother, Ernest. Like, isn't there that poor kid has just fucking nothing at the end of this. I mean, I guess they have some money, but I don't know who's executing the will at that point. They all die horrible deaths. And what's interesting is that they are all outwardly very good people who seem to care a lot about Victor and want what's best for him, right? But Victor also experiences that as a certain kind of cruelty because no one understands him. Everyone wants to help and no one can. And then he has his own kind of form of helplessness. And of course that is very much mirrored in the monster. And I think the monster understands himself much better than Victor ever understands himself, which is part of the theme of the book too. But like, that is the monster's experiences. And this is part of how the monster gets through to Frankenstein when he's already killed William and Justine, is because the Victor starts to recognize part of what the monster is talking about in that experience. And then it fades over time, and Victor cannot overcome himself. But like, that is another thing that is, there's a subtlety to this whole characterization where like the father is a very nice man. And Victor, there's so many passages of Victor describing his father as like the best dad you could ever ask for, basically, right? And would deny me nothing and all of these things that becomes in and of itself a form of neglect in this weird way, because he will deny him nothing except the things that Victor probably actually needs, which is like a, hey, bud, are you okay? That kind of like, right? That kind of like basic, like, let's talk about your feelings. And of course, Walton, partially because he's stuck in the ice, there's nothing better to do, but also because he wants a friend, he's fascinated by this guy, he sees something of him. Walton wants to have that conversation, which is why Frankenstein unburdens himself at this point, in a way he never did with anyone else. Like, that is another tension in the novel, is that we're only hearing all these things now that Victor has spent a lifetime not telling anyone, and that's also interesting.
Yes, that he just can't bring himself to reveal the monster, to expose that ugliness. And it again, like it's all obviously like draped in heavy metaphor of that, like there is a literal monster, but there is also the metaphorical, the thing inside of him that he just can't bring himself to show people because he's afraid of it and he doesn't know how to. I want to highlight one passage that kind of like part of this, like Victor's inability to have like true introspection on himself in like in the places that it really matters. Because I just find this passage really fascinating. And actually, just like to talk about this whole scene where he creates the monster, because it's so different than any other version. But so he creates the monster, right? He doesn't tell us how he does it. But it's just in this like manic fit over the course of like 2 years or something. He is like just obsessed with this idea of building the monster, of this way of infusing life into something that was dead. We, the audience, know that this is because it's his mother's death, right? That like you reading, seeing the sequence of events can tell that's the thing that's motivating him, but he himself doesn't understand that, and he's not telling us that, right? He has no like sense that even at the end of his life, as he's telling us this story, I just think it's interesting with Victor that he's never figured it out. Like, he never put together the thing that has caused him to do all of this is this unprocessed grief and trauma over the death of his mother when he was a kid. And that is what has like created this obsession he has with death. He never really puts that together. He then creates the monster, infuses it with life. And when he does, I'll read this passage and I'll skip a little bit to go a little bit further, where he says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful? Great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep." I'm going to pause there just for a second. So I love this like idea that he makes the monster and he looks at it and all of a sudden he kind of comes to himself and realizes what he's done. That he's like spent 2 years reanimating a dead corpse. And it's like, and now he's like, oh, this is kind of weird. And I love that, like, what his reaction to that is, I'm just going to leave and go into my bedroom and I'm going to drop onto my bed. Like, it's not, this is like, it's such an insane reaction to this.
Well, if you're going for the autism spectrum reading of Frankenstein, this is the most like autism-coded thing you could write, in the obsession with like learning and creating and doing this thing, but then this sense of like detachment from it afterwards, which is also like an ADHD thing. This is why autism and ADHD are often like comorbid like things in the human mind and body. And it's like that, you know, ultra like focus on something, hyper fixation, and then this like removal and like sense of like, well, wait, what did I do all that for? You know, and I relate to it. It's crazy. It's an amazing passage.
And I love that his reaction to it is not, I need to like destroy it, or I need to lock the room, or I need to go get someone, or it's not, I need to flee in horror. It's, I'm going to go into my bedroom and then flop down on the bed. And then I've got to continue, because this is where it gets to the next part that's very interesting. That he relates this dream he has and he never fucking talks about it. And just like set it up, there are lots of passages where Victor breaks out of the narrative mode and talks to Walton directly, right? There are like moments like for instance, when Clerval dies, there's a big stretch before it happens where he breaks out of the narrative voice and just talks about Clerval, and it's clear that like, oh, Clerval's going to die, because he starts talking about him in the past tense. But like, he has these moments where he does give us self-reflection and break the narrative mode, which is why when he has passages like this where he does it, it really sticks out. So this goes on, he's in his bedchamber, he says, "At length lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her. But as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. When, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed down the stairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. So that, we talk about, obviously this is before Freud, but there's a reason why psychoanalysts very quickly flocked to Frankenstein. There's like a billion psychoanalysis readings. That dream about him seeing Elizabeth on the street, him running over to kiss her, and then her turning into his mother's corpse in his arms with like the grave worms writhing through the flannel of her dress is such a potent image. And I love that he doesn't reflect on it. Like, he doesn't stop and is like, oh, this maybe is why I made the monster and was so obsessed with reanimating life. He doesn't like ever process how deeply connected the death of his mother is to everything that he has done. And he never does, because it never really comes up again in the book. But it's like, it's that little dream, that nightmare, and then obviously it then connecting to him wakening and seeing the monster peering in at him while he's in the bed. Because he just left the monster in the room next door in an unlocked room. So it's like, it's such an insane, like weird, kind of uncanny passage that is just so loaded with meaning. But I think the most important part of it is that Frankenstein himself does not understand the meaning of it, and he never does for his whole life.
Right. This is also definitely a passage that is very influential to Del Toro's take on the text, as we shall see, where he does literally cast the same woman, Mia Goth, as both the mother and Elizabeth, and plays on particularly the Oedipal readings of the book very, very heavily. That moment is one of those things where you can just see the kinds of stuff in literature and society at the time from which psychoanalysis would be born, I think is one way you could say it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then that passage goes on. I'm not going to keep reading it, but it goes on to, like, he sleeps in the courtyard, he gets up, and then he goes out walking in the town, like, and constantly like being afraid that every corner he's going to turn, he's going to see the creature there. But he just leaves the creature in his room and just goes out walking. And then he meets Clerval. They go back. He kind of bursts open into his room being like, I need to get in there before Clerval sees it. And the monster's just gone, which is part of the thing that creates that ethereal sense of like, is it even real? Was it part of this wild nightmare he had? All this kind of stuff. But it's like, but that reaction to the monster, I've just always found it so fascinating that he doesn't, it's like he runs from it in stages, but there's this sort of like disassociation or something, that it's such a strange reaction to the thing he's done. And it's so different than every adaptation. Like, no adaptation does this. Either he's like horrified by the monster immediately and just like runs screaming away, or with a much more common one, which almost every adaptation does, is like in the 1931 one, where he is like elated at the success of the thing, that he's like finally done it. And then slowly he comes to disappointment as the creature is not the thing that he hoped it would be. But that's a very different reaction than what he does in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see, and just to be clear, like, saying this does not put down any other adaptation necessarily, because I think there's a million good ways to do it. But I would love to see an adaptation that takes this element faithfully, where I would love a version where the first good look we get at the monster is in the Alps when he talks to Frankenstein. Like, I think that is something that is so clear in the book, where, like, it's not even clear Victor really knows what this thing fully looks like animated. He obviously has it on the table, but once it's like up and moving, it is so spectral. It plays. This is the other thing, is that there is, in expanding the science of how he does it into a more science fiction valence that all the adaptations do, it also makes all of that stuff feel much more solid and purposeful, and he is doing this thing and all of that. And in the book, it really does, in addition to like the kind of autism allegory we were using, it's a haze, it's a dream state. It's like this thing that consumed him, but he wasn't quite aware of. And there is this sense that, like, maybe none of that happened. Maybe this is, we don't fucking know. We're listening to a guy on a ship in the, you don't really get proof that any of this happened until the end of the book, when the monster meets Walton directly, right? But like, even before that, there is this sense of wondering, like, what is the actual reality of this? You go really deep into the book before really knowing if that monster is a thing out there doing stuff, right?
Yes.
And I think that's fascinating. And I think there's a movie that could play with that, like, strip away the sci-fi trappings that have maybe been layered onto the text over time and do this much more ethereal, interiorized version. And I would love to see that one day.
Yeah, and there's just something like incredibly intimate about how the creature's created in the book, that it's just in his own living apartment. That like the first time he has a real confrontation with it is when it comes into his bedroom and peers through the curtains of his bed. And that's the only time that the monster really manifests in any of the city locations, right? Because after this, the monster only really appears in remote places in nature. Because again, that's part of like the whole romantic piece, is this sense of when you're going into nature, you're going into another world. And there's something about the sense of that it's this thing born in the heart of this like private little bedroom in the middle of this city, this little horror he's created, that then poofs, it vanishes away, and he thinks it's gone. And then once he goes back out into the world, he sees that it's kind of everywhere, and that everywhere he turns, eventually the monster will show up. And when he goes out into nature, and he can kind of connect, with nature in his purest self and all this kind of stuff, that's when the monster truly appears. Either in the mountains or out in the Scottish moors, when he's making the mate for the creature, or at the very end when they're on the ship in the middle of the ice in the Arctic, right, where there's not a human soul around that's not on that ship for miles and miles away, that's where the monster appears. But it's just such a different vision of how this thing exists and manifests, and it is so cool. I think it just really captures the sense of that sort of vague, bizarre world of the novel, where you're always in this slightly dreamlike state when you're encountering the creature and dealing with it, because you're not really grounded in any one specific reality.
Totally. I mean, there's definitely a reading of this text that, like, whatever Victor did isn't science as we would understand science, right?
Yeah.
That it is some kind of magic. And obviously, our understanding of what science is in 2025 and the delineation between that and other things is very different than that delineation in 1818. But I still think, like, that is one thing, is if I were making a Frankenstein movie, one of my first rules myself would be, like, don't treat it as science fiction, or even as fantasy. Like, it's something... If I wanted to illustrate that aspect of the book, it's a different generic kind of thing, if it fits into any genre at all. Because then much of the book after that point is, like, the one genre this definitely does fit into is horror. It's a horror novel. It's scary. It's all these horrible things are happening. It's a mystery for a while, because you have William killed and you have what happens to Justine. And again, it is not clear. Like, the Frankenstein has his strong suspicions, but we don't know for sure until much later in the book, and all of those aspects of it. And it is properly, frightening, and I think sometimes more on an existential level of, like, how sad things are. But it is definitely, it's been getting cold and wintry out here, and it's the right environs to be reading a book like this.
Yeah, definitely. It's obviously it's not scary in the way that like a Stephen King book is trying to be scary, but in that sort of like it's making you confront another world, is make you confront like the unconscious in these kinds of things, and commune with like a spiritual kind of reality that goes beyond the world of reason and science and all that kind of stuff. Because part of what you're saying with like it might as well be magic, I mean, that's how Mary Shelley foregrounds it, because when he's a kid, Frankenstein is not interested in reading what were at that point modern day contemporary scientific texts on natural philosophy and all this. He was interested in reading ancient works of like the Greeks and like philosophers, or not philosophers, think of the Philosopher's Stone, alchemists and stuff like that. I'm blanking on the name, because they name drop a couple of like actual historical quote unquote alchemists. I don't know what actual alchemist means. That's a loaded phrase, but people who claim to be able to perform alchemy, and he's reading those kinds of books, and those are the things he's obsessed with. And when he goes to university, there's that part where this is one of the places where you get some of like what turns into the mad scientist version of him, where he meets that one professor who just kind of laughs in his face when he talks about all the people that he's read, and it's like, oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I can't wait for you to open your magic show or whatever. Like the professor just laughs him off. And then there's this other professor that is kind of fascinated by it, because he's like, oh, but that gives us like a way of going beyond where we've been, that like reaching deeper into the past. This is part of that romanticism idea, going back to things that we have maybe discarded that are more mystical in nature, that in and of itself is the next frontier, right? This is the kind of thing that like a character like Abraham Van Helsing represents in Dracula, is this fusion of the occult and the scientific that is the thing that really gets access to deeper truths about reality. And that's very much how Frankenstein is depicted in the book, and that's how he gets to the place he gets to, is because he is not just a scientist, he is he's an emotive person. He's a romanticist. He is an artist, right? He is this person who has that kind of connection to the world. That's the thing he's pursuing, more than like the harsh, strict, like scientific method that's being presented by more of like an Enlightenment era figure.
Right. And then, of course, there is the entire spiritual, theological dimension of the story, that it is about a creator. It is about someone creating life and then having the, responsibility of that, which he shirks, and all of that. And, of course, the feeling of the monster being someone who was created and feels abandoned. And of course there are so many myriad readings that are tied up in that. It is the true brilliance of the book, in that it is about two characters who each inhabit one another's positions in various ways, right?
Yeah.
So like Victor Frankenstein is someone who himself was created and has a mother and a father and a god, if you want to, put that into it and all of that. But then is also a creator. And obviously many of his feelings around his parents and his creation go into making the creature. And the creature is someone who has been created and been cast off and has to wander through the world in that way. And so, and there's just, I do love seeing this in adaptations and other takes on the story, is the different ways you can take those ideas and kind of that cycle that is there. It can be very like theologically rich if you want to go in that direction. It can be very just sort of broad and existential. There's so many things that come out of that experience, and particularly from the creature, who is the most eloquent in expressing those ideas. And it is like the true brilliance of the novel is, I think, in the way these characters mirror each other, are different aspects of one's psyche, but also all of this human condition. And of course, the other thing to bring into all of that is that it's also it's by Mary Shelley, who is a woman who has had kids. It's something that I do think maybe gets lost in some versions told by men, or that I even find myself as a guy who cannot literally create life, like sometimes thinking like you can overcomplicate it almost, and like what this is about. And it's about a man who wants to be able to create life. This thing that like men in the like cisgender, that sort of way cannot do. And of course that's on Mary Shelley's mind. She's already lost one child at this point. She's had another. She's lost a mother. Like, all of that is in the book, and it's in the book in such interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the key things about the book is that it's not any sort of allegory, right? Like when it's bringing in its religious imagery, it's so complicating it because it's all weaved together. Because, in the ending of the book, you get in like quite close sequence to each other, Victor Frankenstein comparing himself to Satan from Paradise Lost, and then the creature in his last appearance does the same thing when he says the line about even the fallen angel himself had more companions than I. I mean, actually, the monster quotes Paradise Lost directly. He says that all that is good in the world is now evil to me, which is the thing that Satan says in Paradise Lost. And so there is this sense of like, that it's not an allegory in the sense of like the creature is not just an allegory for Adam, and Victor is not just an allegory for God, but they all, both of them occupy in different ways kind of all three of those roles. They're all God. Like the creature takes on an almost like biblical Old Testament God-like relationship to Victor in the ending sections of the book, of like kind of where he says, and this is a line that the Del Toro version actually pulls in, which is that you may be my creator, but I am your master. And he kind of reverses that role, and he becomes this sort of like, I will control you and bring suffering upon you, which is, not a thing that, people like to think about the Christian God doing, but it's definitely a thing that the Christian God did to some motherfuckers. He smote some people. Like he's very, he causes suffering and tests people and things like that. It's very much what the creature does to Victor. Then the creature, obviously the Satan comparisons are very clear. He makes it himself, and he is obviously also an Adam. And then Victor is all those things. He creates the life of the creature, which makes him a godlike figure. He himself is like a fallen angel, which is what he compares to how he compares himself to Satan, because he was someone who was capable of so much good, and he has ended up spending his life causing so much misery and evil, and that's the context in which he compares himself to Satan. But then he himself is a son. He is an Adam. He is someone who was created by a father and an absent mother, effectively, which makes it more apt. And then he has a promised Eve, but that promised Eve is never delivered to him in the same way that the creature's promised Eve is never delivered to him either, partially because I think for both of them, that Eve would not actually do the thing that they wanted to do. The relationship, the marriage to Elizabeth would not fix Victor's problems, and probably Victor creating that other creature would probably not actually help the monster as we know him. Like Bride of Frankenstein very famously ends with actually having the Bride of Frankenstein be created, but upon seeing the creature in that movie, the Bride of Frankenstein is just as horrified by him as anybody else is. Because just because she is a creature like him doesn't mean that she would not also have the same biases, which is a thing that Victor thinks about, and is one of the reasons why he decides not to create it, is that he foresees the possibility that this would not actually solve those problems and just create more. And it's one of the reasons why he destroys it. And so there's all those like religious parallels between both figures are so complex because all three of them occupy all three of those roles. And I guess like a Jesus figure like role as well, if you want to just put like the son in there, and it's all tangled together in this kind of like perverse mishmash, which is part of what makes it so compelling, because it feels perverse. It feels obscene in many ways. Like it's something where I'm always kind of surprised that there has not historically been like religious orthodoxy backlash to Frankenstein as a novel, because it feels like it is like do it more than like a Harry Potter or something like that, because it has witches in it. But like Frankenstein is like, if you read the novel in certain ways and use certain lens to assess it, like it's very critical of the nature of God's relationship to humanity. Like if you're trying to interpret it like that. And so it's a thing that I think it is very powerful, because it looks at you as, we are all like Victor. We are all like the monster. We all have complicated relationships with our creators, and we have complicated relationships with the things we create. And all of us have in some way been, this would be putting words into Mary Shelley's mouth, but we've been abandoned by God. Like, she lost her mother when she was a child. She lost her first child when it was 2 weeks old. Like there's a sense of a cruelty to whatever that creator is, that it gives and takes life away so callously. That you feel that, I think, complicated relationship in the text of the novel so potently.
Absolutely, but it is also this fascinating closed loop, because at a certain point, Victor cannot blame anyone but himself, because he has taken the role of God, all of these things. And this is, not to get too far ahead, this is my favorite thing about the Del Toro version, is I think it gets the multivalent nature of these relationships. Like, it's able to create a scene, like its final scene is a scene that doesn't literally happen in the book, where you have this kind of final conversation between Victor and the monster, where now you have the God figure is also a man confessing on his deathbed, and the creature figure is also a priest, like spiritually, because Del Toro brings in all this like Catholic imagery, which is not technically in the book in so much of a sense, but is like very amenable to it. And it's something I love about this story in general.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Anything else? I mean, obviously we could talk about the book all day, but is there anything else we want to do before we move on so that this podcast isn't 7 hours long?
Let's move on, because we'll end up talking about more about the book, I'm sure, when we talk about the movies and compare it. But let's move on to the most famous of all the movie adaptations, which is the James Whale Frankenstein from 1931. I've got some brief notes here, so just some of the background of the movie. The most famous version of Frankenstein, was created entirely to capitalize on the tremendous success of Universal Studios' Dracula, which was released in February of 1931. That success of Dracula led to Universal seeking out other horror stories to adapt, which is obviously now how we understand this, like the very famous Universal horror movies, all generates from the huge success of Dracula. And the first one they made after Dracula was Frankenstein. The screenplay is adapted from the 1927 play Frankenstein, An Adventure in the Macabre by Peggy Webling, although we'll talk about a little bit more in a second about the weird screenplay credits, but that's where its source is from. That itself pulls in elements that had been popularized in earlier theatrical adaptations, like in the original adaptation, where you've got Fritz, Frankenstein's assistant, you've got the line, "It's alive," so some of those things are not original to her play version. It's pulling from the many, many play versions that had existed since the novel's inception. The movie was obviously a massive success. I think that needs to be stated, because it became an instant pop culture icon. Like the image of Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster is the Frankenstein's monster we all think of for a reason. It was a financial success. It was a critical success. It spawned a seemingly endless line of sequels. If you want to see one of the most absurd Wikipedia pages of all time, you can go look for like the page that it's like what movies that the Frankenstein's monster appeared in, a list of films featuring Frankenstein's monster. If you go to that Wikipedia page, it is just endless. It's absolutely endless because it includes TV show episodes and shit like that. It's just like the degree to which the Frankenstein's monster from this movie is a pop culture icon is like easy to underestimate, because it's like, it's crazy when you actually try to look at the number of works that reference the iconography of this film. The movie was on the end of a lot of controversy around censorship, which is something I always find interesting to look at, partially because you can see it in the movie. So the scene where the monster...
just to give a slight bit of context to this is 1931, and so this is right on the cusp of the Hays Code, the production code that would censor Hollywood for decades, coming into being. It's like forming at this time, but you have a lot of movies in this period of like 29, 30, 31 that are technically pre-code movies, but of course played after the code was created. And so there's all sorts of, like, a lot of them are lost, a lot of them have pieces missing, and had to grapple with this sudden repression and censorship that was happening to the industry at this moment. And Frankenstein is like right on the cusp of that.
Exactly. So the most famous one of these is the scene where the monster throws the little girl in the lake, which is like one of the most pivotal scenes in the movie. So it's like wild to think about seeing the movie and having that cut. But that was cut for showings in various states at first. But then when the Hays Code, as you say, when the Hays Code was officially adopted, that is when it was then basically cut from every version of the movie. For many, many years, that scene was thought to be lost, but it was eventually found and restored in the 1980s. And so if you watch it today, you have that scene is in the film. But if you're wondering why that scene looks like all of a sudden the film looks like way worse, it's because it is from a different film source. There's one other instance.
It's from a print. It's everything else we have, I believe, the negative for, and it looks like the 4K of this movie looks fucking amazing.
Yes.
Especially for the period, but it's been well cared for. But it was the original negative that was literally cut for those Hays Code cuts, and so when things are reinserted, it's just from show prints, and those do not age as well. So, yeah.
Yes. So you can see that. There's one other one where you can really notice it, where it's when Frankenstein makes the monster. He has a brief line where he says something like, "Now I know what it feels like to be a god." And that also was cut out for religious sensitivity reasons. And so when all of a sudden you're like, oh, because that's like in the middle of a shot. It's not like a sequence. It's just in the middle of the shot when he's making the monster. All of a sudden, obviously the film quality gets way worse, and all of a sudden the audio is very crackly. So if you're wondering what the fuck was going on with that, that's what that was. In terms of our crew, the director for this movie is James Whale, who is kind of like Mary Shelley, just an absolutely fascinating figure. Obviously, you could do just the whole podcast just talk about this guy. Whale had notoriety at this point for directing the World War I film Journey's End in 1930, which was itself based on a theatrical play that he had directed. Whale would direct several more films for Universal throughout the 30s, but due to a Nazi-coordinated backlash to his film The Road Back, which was an adaptation of Eric Maria Remarque's follow-up to All Quiet on the Western Front, Whale ultimately had a falling out with Universal and retired from filmmaking in 1942. So we have a lot of tragedies that the Nazis caused. This is not one of the most important ones, but it is one of them. It's always like it's always weird when you go back to history and you're like, there's another fucking thing the Nazis did. Like, you don't think about it, but like they obviously tried to wield like fascist, like censorial oppression on media, and certainly any media released in Germany, and it ruined Whale's relationship with the producers at Universal because he didn't want to obviously edit the film and all that kind of stuff. So he retired from filmmaking in 1942. Tragically, Whale committed suicide in 1957 by drowning. Notably, Whale was openly gay in the 1920s and 30s when he was working in Hollywood, and that was obviously extremely rare at the time. And so one of the reasons why he's very famous now is because as LGBTQ film theory developed, his movies, and in particular the sequel to Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, were reevaluated through that lens. And now The Bride of Frankenstein is held up as like his sort of masterpiece because it is like very amenable to queer readings. I think it's a little bit hard to do that with the original Frankenstein. The Bride of Frankenstein, very much so.
I say it, so I'm sure you can. I noticed this. So this was actually my first time watching this movie in full, believe it or not, and I noted I was like, there have to be queer readings of this. I wrote that like in my notes right away, and I went and looked it up, and I was like, this is, because like the moment that, one is just the way Frankenstein is played has a very like clear queer subtext. The entire idea of him being off away from his family and his nominal fiancée with another guy in this tower working on stuff. Like, It's a very clear queer context. My favorite moment is that after he creates the monster, and the whole he's alive, all of that stuff, we cut away to something else for a little bit. Then we cut back, and we cut back to Frankenstein leaning back in his chair and smoking after the creation scene, and it is the most like obvious post-coital imagery you could ask for. And yeah, that is where I paused the movie and went and Googled how much literature is there on this, and there's a lot.
You should watch The Bride of Frankenstein.
I know. Yeah.
If that's the thing you were responding to, because there's a lot more there, because there is another figure. I think his name is Dr. Pretorius. That is one of Frankenstein's mentors, and together they make The Bride of Frankenstein. There's a lot there in that movie that goes a lot deeper in that regard. If people are interested in James Whale, there is a very good movie based on his latter period of his life and his death, which is Gods and Monsters, which is Ian McKellen plays James Whale. I haven't watched it in a long time, but I remember it being a very good movie, and Ian McKellen obviously is fantastic. And so James Whale, interesting fucking guy. Like this is a brief. There's a lot more you can go into. I just want to give a brief shout out to the man. Other credits on the movie, the writing credits for this movie are fucking hilarious with the opening slide. So the writing credits that they give are, this is based on a composition by John L. Balderstone from the novel by Mrs. Percy B. Shelley. If you want to think about fucking historical misogyny, imagine a woman being credited by her husband's name in a movie. Like, imagine you watch the movie today and that's how the women were credited. It's fucking wild. Adapted from the play by Peggy Webling, screenplay by Garrett Fort and Francis Edwards Farragut. So the basics are, quote unquote, Mrs. Percy B. Shelley, or Mary Shelley, wrote the book. That book was adapted into a play by Peggy Webling, which itself is pulling from other play versions. That play was then treated for a screenplay version by John L. Balderstone, but then that was actually turned into the real screenplay for the movie by Garrett Fort and Francis Edwards Farragut. And it is just like an insane list of credits that it's just like a fucking Ouroboros loop of credits that is insane to try to process on the film. Cinematography is by Arthur Edison. People would know he's done lots of incredible movies like All Quiet on the Western Front, The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca. The music is by Bernard Kahn. The main thing you would notice that from is King Kong, which you can see the similarities, particularly at the end of the movie. The song that plays as the movie ends is very similar to a song from King Kong, which I like.
But there's only music at the beginning and end. There's no actual score in the movie itself.
Sure, yes.
Which is the same as Dracula. Dracula does have, you can watch a version that has a score added by Philip Glass, but in its release it had no music other than the opening and ending. Yeah, I mean, one thing to say right away, Sean, that I think is fascinating about this film is, if you want to understand how history is not actually linear, we think of like, oh, over time we get more human rights and we become more enlightened. And it's like, no, we fucking don't. Because in 1818, Mary Shelley is able to write a book and publish it, and people read her work and all of that stuff. And something we didn't talk about with the novel is how like progressive, even for today, parts of that novel are, like in how it talks about things. There's this section where they're talking about like the nature of one of the major themes of the book, the nature of ambition and man's need to create. And some of the lists of things Frankenstein says that are bad are things like the rapid settling of America and like the destruction of Peru and Mexico. And it's like, if you said that today, you'd be called DEI woke and be kicked out of school and all of that shit, right? It's like, and there's lots of parts like that in the book. And then you get to over 100 years later, 1931, she can't even be credited by her name because this is an industry where women are literally not allowed to work in those roles. Yeah. Hollywood was totally apartheid in that way, in terms of who could be there and who couldn't. And so she has to be credited as Mrs. Percy B. Shelley. The film is like so much more conservative than the novel. Like the whole thing of like, we have a criminal brain versus a good brain. Like that is the kind of thing Mary Shelley herself would mock in the book Frankenstein, like the phrenology stuff. It's like fucking crazy. And that is one thing that I just think like, it's always good to be reminded of this, that's not, history does not actually move as this forward arc. Like, there are ways in which the world Mary Shelley lived in 1818 were more progressive than our world now. There are other ways where it was much less progressive, but like, the history is not a straight line, guys.
Oh, I mean, William Gibson and Godwin. William Gibson is the cyberpunk
sci-fi novelist.
But, yes, but Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft would be like crazy left radicals by modern standards. I mean, not to say that Godwin didn't always live up to his own like political ideals, but the shit that he wrote in his books are like way radical left, like so much further than any modern government. So yes, for sure. I mean, again, these people were fucking hippies, like free love people. Again, didn't always live up to those ideals, but those were the ideals they tried to live up to. So yes, very much so. History is not a straight line, and things don't always just sort of become better over time.
Yeah, it's just something to note here, because that was a whiplash for me, I have to say, Sean, was reading the book and then watching this movie. And like, having that surprise of like a book from 1818 could be, just because we have that embedded in us that older means more conservative or something, which is stupid, but that's this thing we have in our heads. And realizing like, no, this is a extremely progressive like piece of literature. It's very leftist in all these ways, right? And then you go, and this is like peak conservative Hollywood. What you have in Frankenstein in some ways. In other ways, it is transgressive, like the queer readings and some of those things. But like a lot of Hollywood stuff, it's sort of a split verdict from this era, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think for the movie, it's obviously like in conflict with the multiple interests that it has, right? Like, because I do think that there is a more progressive class reading of the movie with the way that the monster is treated as a like underclass kind of figure, and the ways in which everybody is sort of like rallied by these wealthy fuckers, and Henry Frankenstein. It's very confusing that they changed the names, and we've got Henry instead of Henry Clerval, you've got Henry Frankenstein. And then instead of Victor Frankenstein, you've got Victor Moritz, which is Victor Frankenstein's friends. I have no idea why they changed the names. It's absolutely infuriating. It makes it very hard to talk about. But Frankenstein's father, the Baron, is this like just awful fucking guy who's like, oh no, this wine is wasted on them, and all this shit. And is this kind of incredibly odious figure. And so I do think that there is definitely a more progressive reading of the film. And certainly there's the queer stuff in it, though. Again, I think like that for me is overshadowed by how much more pervasive that is in the Bride of Frankenstein. But I do think that there is a more kind of progressive kind of class reading of the movie, but also the movie is kind of at war with that in different places. Particularly, I mean, the very ending of it is very weird, that it's that classic old Hollywood like scene that feels like it's just inserted out of nowhere, where Victor/Henry is back in the bed with his wife and the Baron Frankenstein is there, and that whole like scene is just such a weird end cap to the film as the monster burns horribly to death in the windmill. And they've made the monster, I think, a hugely sympathetic figure in this movie, and that's where like my work is reading comes from, is that like the monster is this like really sympathetic creature that is effectively a child that is being horribly used and abused by these people, and is only lashing out because it's being hurt. And there's no sympathy for it whatsoever from the people that exist in this world, but you can see so much humanity in Boris Karloff's performance in the creature, that, when he gets just burned to death in the windmill at the end, is such a horrible ending for him. It's so awful. That then it just turning around and being like, and now everything's fine, and he's at home with his wife, and the Baron's gonna have his wine or whatever, and the movie, then you get your title card. There is a huge whiplash I have with that, the ending of the movie there.
Yeah, so I kind of dove us right into the center of this thing, but like, I mean, let's back up and take the 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
I hate to be a party pooper like this. I don't really like the Universal monster movies. I didn't have any kind of relationship with them as a kid. I've only watched them as an adult. I don't really like these films, the ones I've seen. And I think they're very stagey. I think they're very staid. I think they have a lot of the problems a lot of early sound cinema has. And uniformly, every time I watch like this, Dracula, some of those, I go, man, this would be so much better if they had made this 2 years earlier and it was silent and they were able to like move the camera and stuff like that. I would love it. And so, but I realize that is like my own biases and like I have a very different view on them. And I guess I also want to give you the chance, because I know you like this movie probably more than I do. So I wanted to give you the chance to, okay, yeah.
I mean, I like the movie a lot. I mean, it does have some of those problems. Although, like, I don't like, you know, I don't find this kind of staginess of these movies as an inherently a bad thing. Like, I don't disagree with you that I think, like, you know, there's a lot of equivalent sort of like silent era films are better. But like, I do think that there is a real charm to the kind of like filmed play version of this kind of stuff, especially this and Dracula are the two that I particularly like. Because I think that there's a like way in which I get kind of like wrapped up into the atmosphere of the movie, almost like you're watching a play. And I think it's like just the gorgeous black and white photography, like the fucking sets, I think in this movie like look fucking awesome. The makeup in the design of the creature is iconic for a reason, and I think the performance of Boris Karloff as the creature is phenomenal. Like, it's that thing of where it reminds you that the best special effect a movie can have is a really great actor. And obviously he has the prosthetics and everything to help, but the way he plays the monster as this like infant-like figure who's just been born, doesn't know anything about the world, and is immediately being, you know, subject to this horrible mistreatment because you mentioned the thing with the quote unquote criminal brain earlier, but I think that the movie itself is critical of that idea that like, oh, because he quote unquote has a criminal brain, he's a monster. But it's like, but he doesn't do anything in the movie that's not motivated by something, by either ignorance because he is a literal child, or something has done something horrible to him, like Fritz is torturing him, and that's why he kills Fritz. And so I do think that there's like such a powerful sympathetic entity created in the monster that is to me very potent and powerful, and is kind of about how we produce people to make them a thing, to make them work for us, to make them do the things that we want them to do for our society, and we try to beat them into that, and if they don't fit into what that mold is, then we destroy them and burn them away like they're monsters. And I think there's just like a really powerful narrative performance there centered around Boris Karloff's performance. And I also think that Colin Clive as Frankenstein is giving the like definitive mad scientist performance. You know, like it's a little bit like, it's one of those things where because everything pulls from it, when you go back to the original, it maybe doesn't have as much impact as it always could. But there is something where you just see the like everything pulls just directly from what Colin Clive is doing. And I think he captures some of that manic energy you see in shades of Victor in the book, of when he's like talking about ambition in the movie, that fits into some of the things and his like desire to like, if we, you know, just stopped at this, what would we have? What would society have? Reflects a lot of like some of that attitude you see in elements of Victor in the book. And I think he does a very good job of building that kind of mad scientist character. So I certainly think that it has some of those issues you're talking about that this specific era of movies tends to run into. But I do think that there's also a lot of things to love about this film.
Oh, there definitely are. And I'm not trying to like bring anyone down who loves this movie, which is most people. I understand that. And I will completely co-sign everything about Boris Karloff. He's absolutely a revelation here. Even if you think you know that performance through cultural osmosis, you don't until watching it. It is a absolutely masterful piece of screen acting, and I will agree with that. I do think the movie is like, it felt very at war with itself to me in what its message was, in how evil versus sympathetic it viewed Henry Frankenstein, how exactly it positioned the monster, because I think Boris Karloff has a very clear interpretation of what he's doing, and I often found the movie around him less clear about that, and I think the ending with like Papa Frankenstein certainly does not help in that feeling. and there's things that you have to adjust to, like the fact that the movie uses no music and therefore has none of that kind of emotional or tonal cueing for you is something that I find fairly alienating, because it's a really rare choice actually in film history to not use music in your movie. Usually it would be used for something more naturalistic. To have something that has a fantastical mise-en-scène with no music is like such a rare, it's kind of just these movies that does that, because even silent films would have music all the way throughout. I want to say, like, I think the mise-en-scène is tremendous. Like, the sets are obviously just phenomenal. The photography is immaculate. The lighting in particular, the lighting in this movie is outstanding and is like leagues ahead of what the kinds of lighting Hollywood would settle into, particularly once they start shooting in color. This is like leagues ahead of that. But I also do feel and this is just a part of movies in this period, is once you have actors who have to be mic'd, and the way early sound technology works, like there's a couple of shots in this movie where they are actually able to move the camera, and they're magnificent. Like, you can tell that everyone involved could do these magnificent things with the camera if they were able to, and they often aren't. And I think that's where I get the stagey quality. I don't think the dialogue is very good. I think the delivery, a lot of the actors has this kind of early sound film playing to the cheap seats thing going on to it. I think part of why Karloff works so well is the silence of the performance. And so just all of that I find a little alienating. Like, you have, one of my favorite sets is the cell where they keep the monster in the tower that is just pulled right out of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's this German expressionist set that shrinks to the back of the room, where there's this painted window at the back, but the whole room is these angular walls that are pushing back into it, so it becomes smaller. And I love that kind of thing. But then I do inevitably start thinking about the German expressionist movies from a decade earlier that are quite a bit more sophisticated in their actual deployment of film language. Like, this is part of why, like, Dracula, the Bela Lugosi movie, love Bela Lugosi, I inevitably compare it to F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, that is, like, cinematically miles ahead of it in terms of, like, sophistication in what it's able to do. And so, these are some of my own biases I take in with it, and I didn't, like, experience this movie as a kid and have it be some kind of, like, foundational thing to how I see all of this. So I just want to acknowledge I'm coming at it from a different direction. But that's kind of my experience with it.
Yeah, I think for me, like, I do think there is something unique about the lack of the music and that kind of stage-like presentation. There is a certain almost kind of like, I don't know, hypnotic effect to it. It's so unique. And as you said, like, it's so unique, like the specific tone and style and production method. And there's a way in which you just kind of feel like you're pulled in. And I think it's like there are moments in this movie that struggle with it, because I do think there's a couple performances that don't work for me with, like, Elizabeth and Victor, I think, have that thing you're talking about earlier. But I think Colin Clive, I think Boris Karloff, and then you have some like the kind of the regular players. You have Edward Van Sloan, who's Dr. Waldman, who's the like one of the other doctors at the university, who he is also Van Helsing in Dracula. I think those performances like are really good at building the atmosphere and pulling you into it. But then when you go to some of those scenes that are at like the mansion and you're relying on Elizabeth and Victor, those performances don't like land for me. They don't build the atmosphere of the movie appropriately. And that's where I think the weakness is here versus Dracula, which I do think is the better movie. I think Dracula does a better job of keeping that tone more consistent throughout, partly because Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing is such a big part of that whole film, that you have that more anchoring you throughout the film.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And again, there are. I'm not watching this and going, "Why the hell was this ever iconic?" It's iconic for a reason, and particularly that reason is Boris Karloff, but also the makeup and the effects and the sets and all of that stuff is obviously gorgeous. I did want to ask you, Sean, like, do you think this movie has any meaningful relationship to the book? Because I watch it and I kind of go, it takes the idea of someone animating life, but other than that, I don't really see any meaningful relationship to the book. But you were talking earlier about Colin Clive's performance and kind of the way you read Frankenstein in the book. And as someone who's seen this and read this more times than me, I kind of wanted to throw that to you and think about it. Yeah,
I mean, obviously, it does not have a very strong relationship to the book. It's kind of, if you combine this movie with Bride of Frankenstein, you get more, because Bride of Frankenstein has like the old blind man in it. So you get like, you have the idea of obviously creating the mate for the creature. So you get some of those elements if you kind of put these two movies together. But I do think that there are like shades of it here in the way that I imagine it is if you watch some of those other like stage adaptations where you have like they take some of these elements of the obviously creating the creature and just the central idea of of reanimating this dead corpse. But also I do think that the character of Dr. Frankenstein has these elements of like it's not exactly the character from the book, but I do think that mad scientist piece, they have taken some of those parts where you get that insight into that part of Frankenstein, where he is very manic. Again, there is this like whole big speech, and this will become relevant with the Del Toro version because they kind of do a weird thing with it, where in the book, at near the end, all the people on the ship are like rioting and saying, we want to go home, we got to turn around. We can't go forward anymore. Like we're all going to freeze to death. And the captain is hesitant and doesn't know what to do about it. And then that's when, I think I have the passage here, when Frankenstein, who had first been silent and indeed appeared hardly to have force enough to attend, now roused himself. His eyes sparkled and his cheeks flushed with momentary vigor. Turning towards the men, he said, "What do you mean? What do you demand of your captain? Are you then so easily turned from your design? Did you not call this a glorious expedition? And wherefore was it glorious? Not because the way was smooth and placid as a southern sea, but because it was full of dangers and terror. Because at every new incident, your fortitude was to be called forth and your courage exhibited." And he goes on. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's like almost a whole page. But that element of Frankenstein that you get these glimmers of, because he elides the parts of his manic behavior, he doesn't describe it in much detail. You get these like brief glimpses of like, oh, this is what he was like when he was building the monster. This is that guy who's so fixated on this like achievement and this idea of this ambition, this thing he must get, that he's trying to rouse all these people to continue exploring the North Pole. Which is kind of a crazy thing to do. And of course, eventually they decide to turn back and go home either way. I think that spark is what is the whole Colin Clive character. And he has a similar moment where he's in the lab with the Edward Van Sloan character, and he has a similar kind of speech about like, where would we be? What would we be doing? Like the reason why we're doing these things is because they're great achievements that nobody has thought to do before. And that energy, I think that Colin Clive really grabs and makes it, not the character from the novel, but a version of the character from the novel that takes that idea and turns it into this very iconic mad scientist character that then everybody builds from there. I mean, you just can't do a mad scientist performance without in some way building on what Colin Clive established in this film.
I totally agree with that. And I think like the probably the most memed, not probably, the most like memed, repeated, parodied moment in this movie is Colin Clive yelling, "It's alive," right? Like that is the soundbite that even if you've never watched a Universal monster movie, you've heard that soundbite through cultural osmosis. But I did think watching it in that sequence, it still like takes you aback a little bit. There's a certain Colin Clive lets go of ego in that moment, like as a performer, and is just like letting it come out as though it's involuntary, that is surprising in the context of, and as obviously a very good scene. The animation of Frankenstein, of the monster sequence is incredible, and is part of that performance that really works.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So no, and I liked your response there. I think that is interesting, and I hadn't quite thought about it like that, but this is part of why I wanted to ask you about that. Anything else to say about this film before we move on?
No, I think we should move on so we have enough time to talk about the thing that is the most relevant thing of why we're doing this podcast here and now, which is the Del Toro version.
All right. Well, I put some notes together on the Del Toro version, which just came out, and you guys can go watch on Netflix. So, an adaptation of the book by Mary Shelley has been a dream project for Guillermo del Toro for most of his career. Earlier this year at Netflix's Tudum event, which is like they get on stage and talk about their stuff, he called the film the culmination of a journey that has occupied most of my life, and added, "Monsters have become my personal belief system. There are strands of Frankenstein through my films." He's previously called the book his favorite novel in the world, and said that the best moments in my mind of Frankenstein of the novel are yet to be filmed. He specifically wanted to avoid making a film that was, quote, the classical myth of the monster, and would delve into the Miltonian tragedy of the book, referencing Milton, Paradise Lost, which is obviously in the book Frankenstein. He also talked as early as 2008 of doing a version that would combine the book with elements from the Universal James Whale films, Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. And he spoke admiringly, sorry, hard word, of Frank Darabont's script for the 1994 Kenneth Branagh film, calling it pretty much perfect, while also stating it was ultimately not really filmed. I do just want to pause here and let's briefly address the Branagh film, because that's the 1994, the one called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And what I love about that movie is nothing in the movie. But what I love about that movie is that it is one of the few films in Hollywood that other people in Hollywood feel free to shit on without any kind of reproach. And like if you go to the Wikipedia page and read all the stuff of the people who worked on the movie, like Frank Darabont, or just other people talking about how much they fucking hate that movie, and it's hilarious, because usually people in Hollywood have more candor about like their colleagues and whatnot. But no, if you want to shit on Kenneth Branagh's film, you are free to, and I understand why, because I cannot make it through that movie. I think it is unwatchably bad.
Yes, I mean, I do not disagree. That's why we decided not to do it for this episode.
Yeah. So in 2008, which was the year Hellboy 2 came out, and 2 years after Pan's Labyrinth, Del Toro had a 3-year first look deal with Universal Pictures, meaning they could be the first to produce any of his projects. And there were actually a bunch of projects announced under that deal that were adaptations of famous works, including a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film and a Slaughterhouse-5 movie alongside Frankenstein. But this is a famously rough period for Del Toro because despite having helmed like acclaimed and high-profile projects, he went through this long period of nothing getting made. This also was the period where he was trying to make The Hobbit with Peter Jackson, which ultimately did not happen. Well, the good version of it did not happen. Yes. One of my great what-ifs of film history is if we had gotten Del Toro's The Hobbit, what could have been. Eventually, his comeback was 2013's Pacific Rim, which was a big hit, and after that, he's been able to get movies made regularly every 2 to 3 years. But Frankenstein, the initial version of it, is one of the casualties of that period. By 2009, he had cast Doug Jones as the creature, which made sense. Jones is a very famous prosthetics actor. He played the creature with the hand eyes in Pan's Labyrinth. He is Abe Sapien in Hellboy, and he was the amphibian creature in The Shape of Water. So he's one of the guys Del Toro turns to for this. I think the main reason he's not that in the new movie is because Doug Jones is 65 now, and I can understand wanting a younger actor in that part. Del Toro also intended to work with American artist Bernie Wrightson on the creature's design. Wrightson is an artist probably best known for co-creating the character Swamp Thing, but he also made a famous illustrated version of the Mary Shelley novel in 1983, which specifically eschewed any prior depictions of the monster, like the Universal or Hammer horror films, in favor of faithful reinterpretations of the novel's descriptions. Now, sadly, Wrightson died in 2017 before Del Toro got back around to making this, but a lot of the art in the movie, and particularly of the monster, to my understanding, is still inspired by Wrightson, and was a influence on the film, even though they couldn't literally work together. Funnily enough, the Universal version of this project was ultimately shelved because it didn't fit into Universal's plans for the Dark Universe, the cinematic universe that was announced but ultimately never happened.
Yeah, pour one out for the Dark Universe. It's my favorite picture on the internet is Tom Cruise and all the people that were going to be in that, Benicio del Toro, just standing around in black suits like they were actually going to make more movies.
Johnny Depp was in that picture. This was when Johnny Depp was still hireable. He was going to be the Invisible Man or something. I don't remember. But yeah, Dark Universe did not happen. Hollywood sucks. In 2016, Del Toro explained, Frankenstein to me is the pinnacle of everything, and part of me wants to do a version of it. Part of me has for more than 25 years chickened out of making it. I dream I can make the greatest Frankenstein ever, but then if you make it, you've made it. Whether it's great or not, it's done. You can't dream about it anymore. That's the tragedy of a filmmaker. You landed a 10 or you landed a 6.5, but you were at the Olympics already, and you were judged. That is one of the, best quotes from a filmmaker about filmmaking I've ever seen. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that you're looking at this dream project and being like, well, it can't be a dream project anymore if I actually make it. That's got to be a very complicated feeling.
So in the late 2010s, after Del Toro won his director and picture Oscars for The Shape of Water, he began a prolific relationship with Netflix, with whom he had previously partnered for the animated series Troll Hunters in 2016. His first project there wound up being the stop-motion animated, or his first film, he's done some other TV stuff with them, but his first film was the stop-motion animated Pinocchio, co-directed with Mark Gustafson, which was another passion project that had been in development hell for over a decade. That ultimately came out in 2022 to widespread critical acclaim, but a fair bit of mainstream audience confusion because it is a weird version of Pinocchio. Have you seen that film, Sean?
No, I have not. I do need to get around to it. I mean, there's an obvious... Guillermo del Toro is not a subtle man with the things that he's interested in. I want to do Pinocchio and I want to do Frankenstein. Yes. I wonder what ideas connect these two projects.
Indeed. I do think they are very much sister works in a certain way, and so it's a great film. But Frankenstein was finally greenlit just after Pinocchio won Best Animated Feature at the Academy Awards in early 2023. Oscar Isaac, Mia Goth, and Christoph Waltz were all cast for the roles they ultimately played, along with Andrew Garfield was the original casting of the creature. But in early 2024, just before production was set to begin, Garfield had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts from the SAG-AFTRA strikes, and he was replaced with Jacob Elordi. The makeup and prosthetics had all been designed around Garfield's body, while Elordi is much, much taller. They are not faking the creature's height in this movie. Jacob Elordi is 6'6". Andrew Garfield was 5'10". So they only had 9 weeks to revise the makeup for Elordi, which sounds terrifying to me because that's 8 inches of height in difference. It also means that they didn't have to do nearly as much like trick photography to make him look tall, because he just is that much taller than Oscar Isaac, who he's playing off of. Amusingly, we've got Charles Dance playing Papa Frankenstein in this film, and that's the second time he has played Frankenstein's dad, because he also did so in the abject cinematic abomination Victor Frankenstein in 2015, the movie written by Nepo Baby sex pest Max Landis that is a prequel about Frankenstein getting the inspiration to make the monster, because that's where Hollywood was in 2015.
I don't think I even knew that movie existed. And I will go on to forget that it was made.
That is the one with... I'm forgetting his name, but the young Charles Xavier from the First Class movies as Frankenstein, and then it is Daniel Radcliffe as Igor, and it's about their relationship, and by the end he gets the idea to go do the Frankenstein thing. It's very much the Surf Dracula problem, where, yes. he's gonna surf, but in the sequel. But that sequel never happened because... again, abject cinematic abomination. Del Toro's Frankenstein filmed last year between February and September 2024 on a budget of $120 million, primarily in Toronto, but with additional photography on location throughout the United Kingdom and Scotland. Well, Scotland is in the UK, you know what I mean. The film's crew includes a bunch of Del Toro regulars, including DP Dan Laustsen and composer Alexandre Desplat, both of whom have multiple Oscar nominations for Del Toro projects and one win for Desplat for The Shape of Water. The production designer, which is notable because the production design in this movie is off the fucking charts, is Tamara Deverell, who had previously worked with Del Toro in the production design department earlier in her career in 1997 for Del Toro's second movie, Mimic. And then she was the full production designer on 2021's Nightmare Alley, which she also got an Oscar nomination for. And then the makeup for Elordi was done by Mike Hill, who's worked with Del Toro since The Shape of Water, which somehow did not get an Oscar nomination for makeup. I didn't learn that until looking at this. That's crazy. The co-star of that movie is an amphibian man in prosthetics. The Oscar that year went to the fucking Winston Churchill movie with Gary Oldman. You had a fucking cool monster. I don't get it. The Oscars suck. Anyway,
well, you had a cool monster in one movie, but you had some Winston Churchill jowls in the other movie, and I think those are like equal makeup achievements as far as I'm concerned.
Anyway, the makeup for Elordi was very complicated and included 42 separate pieces of prosthetics, which I just thought was a fun stat. In terms of the script, Del Toro wrote the script himself. It is structurally faithful to Shelley's novel with the sort of nesting doll series of perspectives, but it changes most of the details, particularly for Victor's section, and moves the time period up to the 1850s, whereas the book is set contemporaneously with its writing. The monster story is the most faithful stretch of the film, particularly the part with the family in the forest. Throughout, though, Del Toro mostly avoids directly quoting the novel, instead choosing to write in the voice of the novel. And we talked about, that's kind of an obvious thing you have to do with this book, because quoting the book would be difficult given how lengthy and elaborate it is. But I thought this quote was interesting. He said, when English is your second language, obviously Del Toro's first language is Spanish, you are trained very acutely to the melody and the rhythms of a language. It has a particular rhythm, the dialogue in the book. I tried to make the dialogue be like that without sounding archaic. And we can talk about that more later. I just think it's an interesting idea. Del Toro also noted that both this film and Pinocchio were made in the wake of his parents' deaths. They died sort of back to back a few years ago, and this dramatically affected his adaptation of both stories. He says, I ended up making them basically back to back at a time when I lost my father and I lost my mother. I really had to wonder about who I am, because you become nobody's child. The fact that that happened made them both deeper. Frankenstein debuted at the Venice Film Festival earlier this year on August 30th. It had a limited theatrical run from October 17th, though as is standard for Netflix, it did not play at most major theater chains like AMC. I had to go to the Alamo Drafthouse to see it, but I got to see it on Halloween Day, which was a fun way to spend Halloween, and it then debuted on the Netflix streaming platform on November 7th. As with Pinocchio, this film has been really critically acclaimed, but it has had more divided reactions among general audiences. For instance, my Letterboxd group is fairly split on it, which is interesting. And then I have some other quotes about the film from Del Toro, but that I think are relevant to his approach to the material. But I think maybe we can come back to those as we talk about the movie itself. I really love this film. I have some issues with it here and there that I could talk about in some of the pacing in the first half, but I particularly think the last hour is just an absolute knockout. I love Elordi as the monster. I really love Oscar Isaac. I think this has one of my favorite Alexander Desplat scores to date. The production design is amazing, and overall I just value this movie a lot as seeing a very singular artist like Del Toro make a film that is a very personal tourist reaction to this great book. I think is just very interesting to take apart. But I haven't talked to you about it yet, Sean, so I'm curious for your thoughts as our Francophile.
I'm not. I hate France. France can go fuck itself. I'm a Frankenstein-ophile, not a Francophile.
All right.
I do like the movie a lot, though I think I have probably more issues with it than you do. Specifically that I think it's one of these movies to me that I feel like either needed to be a shorter version of itself or a longer version of itself. Where I think like I love a lot of the approach to the material. Like I think obviously like the kind of main thing it does is it creates this sort of like, it really zeroes in on the like father-son element, and then the death of the mother, right? And that component, and having this kind of different version of the Baron Frankenstein character that is this abusive father. Although I like that he's not like a cartoonishly abusive father, he's a realistically abusive father. Like he clearly cares about his son, but is abusive. He hits his son when he's trying to learn and all that kind of stuff and studying. Is this very kind of oppressive father figure. And then Victor himself becomes the same kind of thing to his creature. And I think like those themes are really interesting and very well explored. I do think that some of my issues with the movie comes in actually kind of in the second half or the first half, depending on how you like approach the problem. That the first half, the Victor's story side of it is so big. It's so long. It takes up so much oxygen and adds in all these like additional subplots around the Christoph Waltz character. It goes like super hard into all the detail about how they create the creature. And I think they do a lot of really good stuff there, and it's a really entertaining part of the movie and sets up a lot of interesting themes. But I think that it then means that the movie feels like it ultimately has almost like a missing section, because then you get the creature part, which is well done. That's obviously the closest to the novel. They're still making lots of differences, which is fine. But then I think once you go out of the creatures part to basically where we're kind of trying to hook up back to the plot of the novel with the I need Victor to make a mate for me thing that the monster wants to do, that whole section of the movie feels very rushed to me. And it feels like there needs to be another, instead of doing the Russian nesting doll thing of we're going in and then we're backing out, it feels like we go in and then we stop. And there's not this sort of like remove again. And there's a lot of things I think make it complicated. I think it feels like Del Toro struggled with how many elements of the novel do we pull in and where and how do we diverge. And I honestly wish that the movie was took less from the novel in specific ways. Like, I don't think it needs the monster trying to get another mate. I think the way that Elizabeth intersects with that plot line is very confused and kind of messy. And the way that Elizabeth's stuff in that back section of the movie ends up not fully landing for me, partially because he doesn't commit to any of those kind of like subplots. And it just kind of feels like a movie that really could have used maybe another half hour, even though it's a long movie, it's 2.5 hours, to flesh out a final section that does more with a lot of what it set up with the trio of the monster, Victor and Elizabeth. Do a little bit more between Victor and the monster, because there's not much interaction between the two of them, because the monster doesn't tell Victor his story. Like, those are some of the places where I have kind of problems with the movie. And so I think it's a movie that has incredible production. It's got incredible acting. Like, the actors are just phenomenal across the board. Like, the cinematography, the look of the movie is great. And the music is also fantastic. All that stuff is so good, but I do think the screenplay is a thing that is just really struggling with exactly how does it adapt this material, where and how does it diverge, and how does it balance all the elements of the narrative, and I don't think it's fully successful in that dimension.
Yeah, I don't know if I have some of the same specific problems you were outlining in terms of the emphasis. I would generally agree. I guess one easy way to put it is I think the first 90 minutes, which is basically Victor's story, and then the last hour is the creatures, I wish we had a little less of those first 90 minutes and a little more in the second half. And I still like all of those scenes in the second half. I don't have, like, I think the choice to do the bride scene and have Victor immediately come back with all of his invectives against the monster, I do think plays with this characterization of Victor, who is just quite a bit harsher. It is this, they really pull forward a lot of the Oedipal elements of it, that like specifically he has all this jealousy over his creation, and they play that as that reason. But I do think there are other like scenes and things I would like to see in there, or just a little more time, because I do think Elordi's performance and like the entire vision of the monster is so good. And it's like, there is no other director working today who can do that thing of like the sympathetic monster as well as Guillermo del Toro. So I wish we did have a little bit more of that. What I find compelling is less the narrative structure than just, I do think like del Toro is someone who's clearly like put a lot of himself. It is such, I think this is true of the best adaptations are in some ways reactions to the novel. They are not just trying to bring it from one medium to another. They are trying to express what they got out of the story, even if that means changing the story and doing new things with it. So, like, this is a story that is... It is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is so much of this movie, but it is also Del Toro's personal like journey with Catholicism is everywhere, all over this movie. This is a super duper Catholic version of Frankenstein, I think in some really interesting ways, which means it also has a sort of degree of narrative about forgiveness and letting go that is not in the book, but is very central to any kind of like Catholic narrative in this sense. And I find the final scene of this movie tremendously moving. And then it also, I think, plays up the psychoanalytic elements in all sorts of ways, from in just the ways that cinema is always inflected by that, but also the way that this novel has been read through that lens so many times. And I think it has like a really interesting take on some of your individual characters, particularly Victor, particularly the creature. I would definitely agree that I think probably the place where it feels the least baked is anything involving the Elizabeth character, who there are some changes to her that I really like. Like, I think making it not his cousin, who's also his sister, is something that you just kind of have to do if you're telling the story today, because it is a part of the book where you go, okay, this was more normal back then, but that's 1818. Sounds weird now, because he's constantly calling the woman he wants to marry his sister. And, you know, we just have to think about that. That's fine. But, like, so some of that, they make her, the other thing they do is they effectively turn her into a Mary Shelley analog, where they have Elizabeth be this kind of, like, Renaissance woman who is literally the person who can see the good in the creature, the way that in kind of the history of Frankenstein adaptations, you often have the book is the one that looked the deepest into the creature, and the adaptations by men don't do that as much. And there's stuff like that. And I would probably agree that I think the ultimate resolution of that story is... There's some beautiful imagery there. I love kind of the shot of her on the rock. There's this very, like, romantic kind of tableau quality to the paint, like it looks like a painting and stuff like that, but it is where the movie feels like it needed more time in the oven on that characterization specifically. But yeah, there's a lot we can talk about here, so I'll let you guide it, Sean. Like, where do you want to go with this film?
Yeah, I guess like thinking about the Elizabeth stuff, because it's one of the most interesting things in the movie. I mean, obviously she's a totally different character. I mean, she's not all that much of a character in the book, I think partially because Victor himself doesn't think or care that much about Elizabeth outside of like the role that she plays in his life. But obviously, as you say, they make her this more Mary Shelley-esque kind of figure, this woman who's obviously very educated for her time, very like curious about the world around her, right? They have the whole thing about her interest in insects and stuff like that. And I like all those changes, and I think expanding on that and creating that, you know, there's the obvious duality of having Mia Goth play both Victor's mother and play Elizabeth, and Victor's sort of impotency in this relationship that she's getting married to his brother, and also she is like weirdly attracted to the creature, and Victor has this sort of like relationship that seems to be developing and gets stunted. I think all that stuff is very effective. I do think where it ends up feeling weird is just how quickly it feels like that gets cut off. That like she's out of the movie for so long when because it doesn't intersect with the creature's story at all, and then when the creature comes back, they have this sort of connection. But it's I think the thing that makes it a little weird is it's not entirely clear at that point how the creature feels or regards her, because he has no memory of his early moments. And the like whole notion of he needs or wants to have a companion. And then in this version, Elizabeth basically is or could be that companion. And it feels like there's a whole kind of like world that this plays with that then it shuts down immediately by having Victor shoot her and blame the monster, and she goes and dies. And it kind of feels like, you know, with the Catholic thing, it's just really bizarre to me that you've just got basically the 2 chapters, that you don't have 3. There needs to be 3. Like, it feels so wrong that it's just, you've got Victor's tale, you've got the monster's tale, and there's just this like, it's like if you're, I don't know, playing a melody and you don't fucking like, you know, resolve the note or something. It's like resolve the chord. Like where here there's tension. There's like these things come in 3s, and especially if you're, you know, very Catholic, it's really got to come in 3s. Or if you want to stretch it out, you can get to 7, but you can't stop at 2. That's weird.
Right.
And there, it really, even though the movie's very long, and I think like it could save this by, there's a lot of stuff in the Victor section that can be really squished out. That I don't know if what it needs is Elizabeth's story, because also I don't know how you fit that in with their having this literally all happen with both characters narrating to the captain, which is, you know, a fine change. I think it kind of makes some things feel a little bit awkward, because that means that Victor and the monster don't get much interaction in the movie, because all of their interaction has to be at the end, because the monster telling his story has to now happen at the end of all this, and Victor never hears it until the end, which I think kind of makes their relationship a little bit odd. But whatever like needs to happen, the Elizabeth's part in the film is like so interesting, and I think is really essential for the like larger narrative he's trying to tell, but it just feels like it's interrupted and it's just kind of left hanging there, and not in a way that feels like an evocative narrative choice to leave it feel unresolved, but in a way that feels like he didn't know how to contend that with also coming back to these other things that are from the book, and they don't feel like they mesh together. In the same way that it, like the monster going to Victor to ask for a mate and this version of Elizabeth existing in the same story doesn't really make sense to me, because it feels like what the monster should do is remember Elizabeth and go to Victor looking for Elizabeth, not being like, I need him to make another creature like me. Feels like a weird hang-on plot point from the book that doesn't really fit in the story that he's telling, which is where some of that whiplash for me happens. That's like, these 2 plot points don't feel like they coexist in the same movie.
So I don't feel that specific, that last part specifically, because I do think these things could coexist. I think you could have the scene as it's played in the movie of him asking and being shot down by Victor, which is like, it compresses the timeline, but it is a very direct adaptation of the book in terms of the creature's ask and Victor's ultimate response. Like, not his immediate one, but his ultimate one. It's the exact same logic. And I think that, again, I think that does dovetail with the way Victor has this jealousy, this impotence, all of that kind of stuff. But I think you could then follow that up with the creature meeting Elizabeth in some way, or Elizabeth overhearing that conversation and being horrified at what Victor is saying. And then you would, I agree that I think there's like an act missing here where like maybe the creature and Elizabeth run off together. And you could play it as explicitly romantic. You could just play it as these are two people who feel like they are, because they also express that Elizabeth feels detached from the world in the way obviously many smart, educated women would feel detached from, you know, society in that period or today. But like, you know, they express that directly. And I think you could have that, and you could like have Victor's hunt for the monster, which is from the book and shows up here, start with him hunting like the two of them down, and like even play it as he kidnapped her, but we know it's not a kidnapping. And I even think you could play her ultimate demise the same way, because I think the idea that Victor directly shoots her is not the wrong idea for the story. I think taking the idea that because Victor kills a lot of people in the book indirectly, right? But they all die. And I think moving that and making that blunt in this movie in the way they do it is not wrong. I would agree with you that I think the structuring and the compression of all of that into one long scene instead of like a scene that sets up another act for the story to take that would then get to this final stretch of them in the abyss of the Arctic would make more sense. Because like I really like how they show the Victor Frankenstein's pursual of the monster, and that they're able to do that pretty economically, because that's a pretty long part of the book, is him describing his long hunt for the monster up to joining up with Captain Walton. And I think the movie condenses that in a good way, but I also think you could take that exact sequence with that extra third act before it that would probably add even more weight to it, the way the book has that weight, because Clerval kind of plays that final death role that Elizabeth is supposed to play here.
Yeah. I think like one other thing in terms of like a kind of oddity about the movie is with how it treats some of like the creature and the Arctic stuff is it is a little weird to me, the exact like dimension of the relationship. And maybe partially this is just like I had the book too fresh and there's like a weird dissonance in my head. But the way that all that plays in the book is like the monster, right, is having Victor chase him across the Arctic, and is just like constantly intentionally staying one step ahead of him. And then at the end, you kind of learn, part of the point of the ending of the book is that you have been so far away from the monster's POV, because that happens in the middle, that when you come back to his speech to the captain at the end, you kind of revisit this like, right, like he has done all these things because he's in pain. And he talks about how like him doing these things, him killing Clerval, him killing Elizabeth, him torturing Victor in this way, like rips apart his own conscience, because he is someone who does want to be good. He does want all these things. And there is a parallel with him and Victor where he himself is consumed by the same kind of manic mood and behavior that Victor was when he created the monster. The monster describes his own behavior in that way, and this kind of emptiness as he stands there. And there's this real sense that like you have been perceiving it as like the monster for this whole time really was on that whole chase is wanting to torture Victor and all this kind of stuff. And then ultimately it's like, that's not really what it was about. And that's not really what he was trying to do. In this movie, there's something kind of weird. And I think it's partially just like the way they open it, that it has to be it's built to be very bombastic, where the monster comes out and he's like, give me Victor, give him to me. And he's fucking just ripping people to pieces. He's throwing them around. He just indiscriminately murders like a dozen of these sailors to try to get to Victor, which doesn't make sense. And it still doesn't make sense. When you come back around to it at the end, where the way they play that opening is like it's the monsters trying to get at Victor, not Victor trying to get at the monster. And the monster so wants to get at Victor so badly, he's willing to murder any and every person who's going to physically stand in his way. And I really don't know how to square that with then when you revisit this at the end, where they try to make it more similar to the book, And why is the monster so insistent on getting to Victor on this boat? Why does that matter to him if Victor is just going to start chasing him again, because that's what Victor's going to do? It's like the opening of the movie is very strange to me. And I kept on thinking that they were going to wrap back around on it and like show how this kind of reversal of the pursuer and the pursued would play out, but they don't, because it kind of defaults something that's closer to that relationship in the book. And I also am just not a big fan of like the monster just going around and ripping people to pieces. Like there's something about it that makes it feels weird that they would characterize him so similarly to the book. And yet in the book, the monster's killings are all motivated. Like he's killing innocent people, but he's killing innocent people who have a direct connection to Victor to cause him suffering, to get Victor to do what the monster wants him to do. And he's not just he doesn't kill the hunter in the woods that takes a pot shot at him, you know? Like that's not what the monster's like. And it doesn't feel like they changed his characterization enough in this to justify the idea that he's just going around murdering people. And so I have a weird disconnect with the beginning of the movie that I think the movie itself doesn't ever really resolve in a way that felt meaningful to me.
I get that. I will say the first time I watched the movie last month, I hadn't read the book yet. And so I didn't really pick up on that in that way. It is something I thought about when reading the book was, I mean, to some degree, the monster is much more violent in the book because he kills people over a much longer period of time. He does it with more intention. He does it with more kind of cruelty in his heart towards other people. You don't have the long string of murders in the movie because it's not structured that way, right? In fact, he doesn't kill anyone in Victor's life at all, really, other than maybe his brother. But his brother, it's because he's coming into the room and he gets thrown around and all that stuff. He definitely doesn't kill Elizabeth, any of that stuff. But you do have him killing those sailors trying to get to Victor out of anger. And I did think about that a little bit. It did seem like a notable difference that I don't know if it doesn't really square with the reading from the book. I don't know if it squares with the stuff later in the movie. You have that interesting scene where they kind of join back up, where they show the moment in the tent where the monster comes in to get Victor and is kind of toying with him and takes the dynamite and lets it explode him because he has the regenerative powers in this movie and it doesn't actually kill him. It's how angry he is at Victor is not the like arc of it is not as clear as in the novel, where it's hyper clear because it is the whole story of the book.
Yeah, it's like exactly how the monster feels about Victor. I guess that's maybe what it is. It's like it doesn't really make sense to me. And I think it's partially because that ending section is so hyper accelerated. He interacts with Victor so little once the monster becomes a full character, right? Rather than the kind of more infantile version of him in the earlier parts of the movie. It's one of those things that makes it feel like there's something missing to explain or justify like the amount of fury and rage the creature feels at Victor. It just is a little bit miscalibrated or something. It feels
I guess one way we could I'll play defense for it in this way. The movie's perspective on the ending very clearly is that the monster has more reason to be angry at Victor than Victor does at the monster. And that is a reversal of the book. Yes. The book is we are in Victor's perspective as he has had everything taken, and we follow him up into the Arctic. The movie is played that the most recent events are, the monster didn't kill Elizabeth, Victor did. The monster didn't really even directly kill the brother. And you had the scene of Victor denying the creature the companion. And so you have all of these wrongs that happen at once. Victor has lost everything, but he's also much more of a dick in this movie than he is in the book, really. And so I think that rage, I think, is expressive and plays that way, because also the end is ultimately about Frankenstein asking for forgiveness. And that is where we ultimately build to, is that the person who has to, fully reconcile is Victor, not the monster. And so I do see some of that on that level. And I think there is a kind of very expressionistic, over-the-top, bombastic nature to the opening that expresses where we're going with that. But I agree there are difficulties in squaring this all.
Yeah, because it just doesn't feel like that also matches up with and now we're going to go on a years-long trek across the world to get to the North Pole that there's a coldness, I mean, both literally but also like sort of emotionally, about what the monster does there that doesn't match up with the sort of like fury. It's just you just kind of get mixed messages. It's where I feel this kind of like a little bit of a battle between the changes Del Toro wants to make and him also wanting to pull like specific things from the book, but not all those elements feel like they fully congeal into what his ultimate vision is. And I like his vision. Like I want him, I wish that some of that vision felt a little bit less inhibited by some of these specific traits or plot points from the book that it feels like he pulls in that kind of get in the way a little bit of this thing, because I do think that ending where Victor, I mean, you talked about it earlier in a great way of this kind of like dual role of Victor as this father figure, but also like someone going to a priest and referring to in that way, in that kind of relationship, and this sort of asking for forgiveness in this Catholic way, but also in this way of trying to like kind of recognize and break this cycle of abuse that he himself was a part of. Like, I think that ending is really fantastic and is obviously not at all what the book is. But that doesn't matter to me. And I wish that like some of the elements in that final act built to that moment for me a little bit more coherently.
No, I get that. And I'll say also, like, part of what touches me so much about this movie, and I was reflecting on this watching it again last night, and this is almost intangible. This is hard for me to like point to a specific scene that gets this, but it's in the narrative. It's definitely there in Oscar Isaac's performance. And I do think this is like the religious aspect of the movie. I was not raised Catholic. I was raised Lutheran, but I do have this like church background. And I have lost a father the way Victor has lost a mother. And so that feeling of things being taken and that kind of rage that comes out of it. And some of that is in the book too, obviously. But I think the way Del Toro casts it and the specific kind of religious pall over the movie is that the characterization I get out of Victor is this. And I think this is a very true relationship, like with God, that people in various faith traditions have, is this duality of both hatred and love, of belief, but also not even disbelief, but like anger. There is this sense that Victor clearly does believe in a God because he rages at God. And you can't rage at something you do not believe exists. I think that's like a fundamental idea at work in this film. And of course, this also plays into this very psychoanalytic take on the material where this really foregrounds, like, for instance, the Oedipal aspects, that like Victor feels that his father, who was the surgeon who delivered the baby that his mom died giving birth to, feels like the father took the mother from him. He feels like an anger towards the father for those reasons. He feels desire for Elizabeth, who ultimately chooses both his brother and the creature over him. So we have all of those aspects, the competition with the father, the ultimate father, and again, this is what we call priests in the Catholic tradition, right? The ultimate father is God. And I do think like there's something about this movie being Victor wants an apology from God. And if he's not going to get that, he wants to be God himself and one-up him. And I think there's something about that idea in this movie that I find really potent. I think it's very potent in Oscar Isaac's performance. I think it's potent in a lot of the scenes early on. And I think the way it comes back around to the ultimate idea of this movie being that the creature finally gets what Victor always wanted, which was this like apology from his creator. He gets this like sense of reckoning with this higher power that brought him into the world and abandoned him. And I do think like that through line in the movie is done really well for me. And I think it's there in Oscar Isaac's performance. I think it's there in Elordi's performance. I think it's there in some of the religious imagery. And it is that there's something about that like, I think if I met Guillermo del Toro, I could have a very deep, long conversation with him about these things and maybe the role of like faith in our lives in different ways, because I see that in this movie in like these intangible but really interesting ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree that all of that's there, and it's my favorite part of the movie. I think it's why I like that kind of the first half or like the first 2/3 or whatever, where I feel like it's setting up all those elements in a way that feels very powerful. And I do think that Oscar Isaac's Victor is just a fantastic character that obviously has lots of elements of the character from the book. I think he gets that sense of the Byronic hero character kind of element of it, is this guy that has these sorts of huge mood swings, right? He's given to these kind of periods of mania. He's given to these periods of depression. He's someone who wants and needs something from the world and doesn't know how to get it. And he's very self-destructive in the way that he goes about it, and that also wraps up other people in the kind of whirlpool of his life. And I do think that Oscar Isaac does a great job of playing that while always keeping him someone who's like this, pretty awful person, but also you can see that there's a good person underneath it. There's like this amazing person there, someone who's capable of incredible things, that just doesn't know how to balance these elements in his life. And I do think that is a really fantastic performance that hits on all those things you were talking about, of that sense of that rage and fury and that feeling of impotency and powerlessness in the world, and his obsessive need with having to get some kind of control from all of that. And that's where he goes wrong, is that he can't figure out how to do it, or once he can do it, he doesn't know what to do with it. Like, I do think the movie, while the specific plot events are technically very different, I do think it gets a lot of the energy of Victor making the monster, and then he's just like, well, what the fuck do I do now? And I love that moment of him sitting on the steps in the tower and just being like, I don't know what to do. Like, I never thought about what would happen after I made this thing. I don't know what to do with it. And you can read this in a bunch of different metaphorical ways of like, this moment of having like a literal child, right? Of like having this moment of incredible passion that's like fueled by all these complicated emotions that you didn't really think it all the way through. And now I got a fucking baby. It's like, and that right. is a tale as old as time. And he is like that in that moment where it's like, I thought this is what I wanted. I thought this is the thing I wanted to make and to have. And now that I have this, I don't know what to do with it. And he's just stumbling blind, and the thing he relies on is all the things that his father did to him. And it's a really great chilling moment where you get presented these scenes of him interacting with the monster where, Victor's not perfect, but he feels more like a regular struggling dad who's really trying to work hard to figure out, what do I do with this child effectively I have, and how do I teach it and raise it? But when Elizabeth comes to visit, you then get this like peek into the other part of what he's been doing, where he has him trained like a dog, and has him like sit and get up, and he gets up on the little like table or whatever, and he starts asking for his leg or whatever, and is going to hit the leg. And the monster just yells at him and rips the thing apart. And I think that whole dynamic of showing him struggling to figure out what to do with this creature, and him just slowly falling into replicating the exact cycles that his father did to him, is very compellingly done.
Oh, I love all of that. I mean, specifically, they bring eventually I think he's using like a fire poker, whereas his father used this like, whatever that is, like a slapping stick. I don't know what, it's an old Victorian thing that you see in these stories, where he's like hitting him. It's like a whip you'd use with a horse. And
like
he's
a caning rod.
Yeah, a caning rod. And then he's doing the same to the monster. And also just the idea of he is judging this creature by how much he can make the creature be like him, which is what his father was doing, trying to train Victor to be a doctor, right? And that is the exact same kind of thing. And Elizabeth even has this line of like, well, maybe his intelligence isn't like your intelligence or something like that. And I like that. I also think Del Toro is good at he hits moments sometimes that are not literally in the book, but feel so of a piece with the book. And I love moments like that. There's two in particular in this stretch you're talking about, Sean. One is where you have, and they're both just great moments of understanding the character of Victor Frankenstein. One is where the monster has his very Jungian mirror stage recognition in the shaving mirror, and then he accidentally cuts himself on the shaving razor, and Victor is like cleaning the wound, and he looks at the monster and says, I didn't do this, you did this. This like displacement of his like agency. That is, I could imagine the character in the book saying that, totally. And then later on, when he's talking to Elizabeth, and she's saying, like, haven't you considered the creature's pain it's in? And he says, what about my pain? And I wrote that down as, like, that is the most Victor Frankenstein line. Because, like, half of that novel, at least, is Victor talking about how sad and broken he is about all the other people who have suffered and died because of his actions. But mostly he is only ever able to express his emotions over what has happened and how miserable it's made him versus, like, he talks about that through the Justine part, but he doesn't really think about, like, how fucking terrified was Justine sitting in jail for something she didn't do, and then she was fucking hung. It's so dark, but he only ever really considers his pain. There's moments like that where it's like, okay, Del Toro has read this fucking book.
I want to read the exact thing you're talking about because it's so good, because this is after he knows that Justine, I think this is after Justine has been hanged, and he hears about it from Elizabeth, and he goes, he says in his narration, "Amiable cousin, such were your thoughts, mild and gentle as your own dear eyes and voice, but I was a wretch, and none ever conceived of the misery that I then endured," which is so good, as this guy is like, well, my brother's been strangled, and this woman, innocent woman who I probably could have saved, has been hung. But what about the misery that I have endured?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just, there's things like that where, like, Del Toro is able to get at the ideas without literally quoting the book or even using, that's a scenario that never happens in the novel.
Yeah.
Elizabeth never knows about the monster. Obviously, this Elizabeth is totally different in all these other ways. But it's just things like that I think Del Toro has clearly thought through in a very, very profound way. We talked about Oscar Isaac. Just talking about Jacob Elordi, who is an interesting actor. He's one of the many people who rose to prominence on the show Euphoria, but I've seen him in a couple of things now where he's very good and a very interesting, serious performer. And this is such a, like, physical performance at first that then becomes such a verbal performance. And it's really a beautiful piece of acting, and it helps that his physicality is just pretty fucking dead on, because it's the whole idea of this big lanky creature that Frankenstein has, you know, stitched together, and so you get a super tall skinny dude to do it. Just all of that works really well.
Yeah, I really love the design of the creature. Like, it definitely, like, it, you know, they obviously clearly intentionally wanted to avoid the Boris Karloff look, and kind of avoid doing your kind of standard versions of the creature. And they went to stuff that looks a lot more like the kind of classical interpretations of it. Like, there's a flyer for that original 1823 stage play version, Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein, that has this like figure that is like kind of beautiful, and is like this huge, like incredible, like almost, you know, like Romanesque statue or something. And I think they're pulling on some of those while making it more grotesque than that. They're obviously he still has like all like the sutures and like the scars and stuff, but the like him being huge, thin, and like the pale element of it, that there is a real beauty to the creature, which I think is important for the movie versions to capture this sense of like, for some of the stuff we talked about earlier in this podcast, of like movies can struggle with, you're always going to be faced with the external appearance of the creature, whereas in the book you are imagining it, but you're getting his voice very directly. And so I think they find a good balance of making him seem very supernatural, very otherworldly, very bizarre, but there is a beauty and a grace to him as well, which is where you can see how in Elizabeth's eyes she's so fascinated with him. And I think that design just like walks that line very, very well, because I think that's a very difficult thing to try to find, is make him feel kind of scary and grotesque in various ways, but also make him very beautiful in other ways.
I love the sequence where you have a montage. I think the movie, again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, overdoes the amount of like, how did he make the monster stuff? One scene I love is him putting the body together from all of the corpses, and it's just so graphic of he's just sawing off legs and ripping flesh, and you see him like build the cavity around which the bone will go, and he's shoving in the bone like he's assembling like a fucking gunpla. It's just crazy. And there's something about that like, when I then read the book and you have the descriptions of him, he doesn't say exactly how he did it, but he talks about my long labors in the middle of the night. I was kind of imagining that in my head, because it's such a, like, I've never seen that graphic an approach to him putting the monster together. But then there is also something weirdly beautiful about it. Like, the movie does have, in a very Del Toro way, this split relationship with, you have all this corpse imagery and death and dissection and all this stuff, but there is also, as Elizabeth is able to recognize, this strange beauty in seeing like what she calls God's design, what you can just think of as anatomy, like the spine going down, the back of the body, all of those kinds of things. Like, you get Victor's fascination with the macabre through the form of the movie itself and the visuals it gives you.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the other very Catholic feeling parts of it is, this like imagery of blood and corpses, right? Which is with the sort of idolization of Jesus on the crucifix is all that, and it's like this extreme version of that, but like the very, kind of graphic, depictions of the wound in Jesus' side and the stigmata on his hands and all that kind of stuff. You definitely get that energy through the way that it's presenting these bodies. And you have that one sequence where Elizabeth comes into Victor's apartment or whatever, and he's got this like dissected corpse, but it's like from the back, and it's just like on his table, and it's the whole spine and all that is exposed, and that's where Elizabeth becomes very fascinated with it. This is also the scene where he gets his sort of like eureka moment of like, the symmetry or whatever. And if I do the thing with the thing and the lymph nodes and blah, 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 and then it will, you have to get your techno gobbledygook because it's a movie that needs to explain things more.
Yes.
But, he has his little, Dr. House moment of I've heard a word and that has triggered an idea in my head.
Although even the way they depict that is so Byronic in the way you were talking about earlier, where he's in the bath and he puts the towel over his head, like he's like, oh, woe is me, and then he has the idea and runs around naked doing it. That's a perfect like representation of Frankenstein.
Yes. But like that whole sequence and the staging of it and the like body, whatever, like the what they have there in the kind of artistic way it's depicted, it's definitely has like this very potent Catholic like mortality imagery. It's really great.
Yeah. But let's talk about that. The amount, this movie does spend a long time getting to the point where he pulls the lever and we get the electricity and we get the creation scene. And I guess my number one question here is about the Christoph Waltz character. I am generally pro Christoph Waltz. I like Christoph Waltz. He's good in things. He's always good in things. He's good here. I think my problem when I saw it a second time and I was able to put my finger on it a little bit more is this character is there for very instrumental reasons.
Yes.
You need him on a dramatic level. You need someone for Frankenstein to talk to, like that is, and I understand that. That's also why Igor, Fritz, whatever you want to call it, exists, is because in the book you're able to have him be totally alone because he's narrating and you're hearing his thoughts. In a movie, he has to be able to bounce his ideas off of somebody, and so in this case we have the Christoph Waltz character. In other versions, you have Fritz, Igor, what have you. So he plays that role, and then he also plays the role by which you can have Frankenstein inhabit what is an objectively incredible set, which is that tower. And I think that tower is such a coup d'etat of mise-en-scène. It's just an incredible series of sets. And of course, you have to have some story by which Frankenstein would have access to this incredible thing. And so you have that character there. And then he is also Elizabeth's uncle, and we play with all of that. I don't think I ever get to a point where I feel like the character has more than an instrumental purpose and where I feel like there's a thematic punch, the way every other character in the movie has their role. Even if, like with Elizabeth, we think it's not played perfectly by the end, she is there for much more than just plot purposes, and that works. I don't think the Waltz character ever gets to that point, other than some pretty clumsy dialogue about the Prometheus myth that is probably the worst writing in the movie. And I don't think the thing of him having syphilis and all of that really justifies the amount of time we spend on him. Because I get to the end of the movie, and I love the last scene, and I'm listening to Alexander Desplat's music as the credits roll, and it says Christoph Waltz, and I go, oh, right, he was in this. And that's not the reaction you should have.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it almost feels like a character that exists in like the mini-series version of this that's like, this is like episode 1 is them building the monster. And he's like an important figure in episode 1, and then you have a whole like an 8-episode season or whatever that moves on from there. But within the movie, absolutely, it's like really bizarre. Like, and it's, while you're watching it, I think it's very entertaining because Guillermo del Toro is a very good filmmaker. Christoph Waltz is a very good actor. It's just like the performance is fun. The like, the moment to moment is very well done. And I do think there are some really good scenes with him. Like I think the scene where the character dies and stuff like that is like a well played sequence. And I do think it gives you a little bit of that sort of the ways in which Frankenstein is always just in it for himself. And he doesn't give a shit about what this guy wants. And so, there's like a little bit there, but there's just nowhere near enough to justify the incredible amount of time that is spent developing that whole side of the movie. And I think like just having it be William and the tower is from their Frankenstein fortune or whatever, or it's like an old tower that his father had that they've inherited, and he goes that, like, there's just
you
like,
could do
really,
that, yes.
yeah, you really don't need to come up with a lot of complicated shit for how or why he's able to build the creature. Like, it's obviously you don't need to, because the book doesn't do any of it at all. The book just goes, right. and then, because you can, you maybe need a little bit more than the book, but you can have a montage and that's fine. And you do not have to spend 40 minutes or something on the movie developing this whole subplot and then have the character just kind of disappear. You do get a little bit of it where, Victor shows William the body, but it is very notable to me that Elizabeth never finds out what happens to that character. Like, it's just like that, like her fucking uncle or whatever, and he just disappears from the movie, and she never learns about it. It's one of those things that makes her feel like weirdly, kind of like with the Christoph Waltz character itself, even though she's very essential to the themes of the movie, it's like at the end of the movie you're like, right, but Elizabeth was there. It's like like she becomes so unanchored from the plot, because once the uncle's gone, it feels like you realize how thin all that connection was, because even though that should be a huge thing for that character, it's not really ever hit on. And so it just creates this whole kind of mess in that section of the movie that really does not need to be there. And I think it's one of those places where the screenplay needed a really good additional editing pass that asked them hard questions. And you could say, let's get rid of that character, condense that section of the movie down, keep all the William and Elizabeth stuff, because you can keep all that and you don't need the Christoph Waltz character to do it. And then have a much more expanded final section of the movie that gives Elizabeth and the creature and Victor more time together to pay off all the setup the movie has for that arc.
Those would probably be my notes as well. And I do understand why Del Toro wants to put his stamp on the creation scene. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because the actual scene is fucking cool. Like, it's that tower set is amazing. The way it is, like, in conversation with the James Whale movie, without really aping any of the iconography, other than the idea of electricity, but it does it in a totally different way. There's lots and lots of cool stuff there that I like. And I think any modern Frankenstein movie, unless you go in a very radically different direction, is going to have to, like, interface with this to some degree. But I think, I would say it's more nested for me in the Christoph Waltz character than in just having these scenes, which a lot of them I like and I think are necessary and are good. But yeah, I will say, I wrote my notes, I do think the moment, because it is so bizarre and out of left field, and I find it funny, where he's in the bathroom with Christoph Waltz and he comments on the French porcelain and the sound it makes when you're urinating in it. That is such a weird out of left field moment. I do kind of like that moment with Christoph Waltz, because it's bizarre and funny. But yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a good one of him. It's a great power play, because it's where, like, he's trying to pressure Victor to hurry it the fuck up. Yeah. He kind of has figured out what's going on with him and Elizabeth, and so he's like, "Oh no, you don't have to leave. I'll be here." And he just pisses at the chamber pot. And he's like, whatever, like, weird rhyme he says. But yes, that is a very good moment.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking earlier about the creature side of things. I adore the stretch, because my favorite stretch of the book is the creature in the house with the family and all of that stuff. And I think my favorite stretch of the movie is, like, the half hour where it is the creature has woken up, goes to the forest, winds up in the mills of that house, and you have David Bradley as the old blind man. David Bradley is a favorite on this podcast, because he is one of the doctors. He is the recast version of the first Doctor in Doctor Who in recent years. He's been in a million other things. He was also Geppetto in the Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein, and I think there's basically no one alive. What did I say? Oh yeah, Pinocchio. Sorry, Geppetto is...
Be very confusing. I didn't realize Geppetto was in this movie.
No, Geppetto is in Frankenstein. God damn it! Geppetto is in Pinocchio, but David Bradley plays the old blind man here in Frankenstein, and I think there's basically no actor alive today who could play that part better, and I think all of that is just beautiful. I love how the film changes its entire palette and sensibility to something a bit more naturalistic for that stretch of the movie, and I think it's the most direct adaptation of Shelley in the film. And I think it's probably the part that when Del Toro has that quote I read about wanting to do things that generally aren't done in adaptation, I'm guessing that's the part of the book he was thinking of, because he really devotes a good stretch to it here. And I love that stretch. I think Elordi is great, turning into this very verbal version of the performance while still sounding like obviously the body that he's in produces sounds differently than a normal human body. I think all of that is really well done.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish it had the whole, I would want to see Del Toro try to tackle just doing the entire gothic romance that the monster observes in the book, right? Because there's this whole like elaborate plot line about these like Arabian people and Felix, who's the son, that he like helped them out of this like financial situation, and he had the daughter promised to him, and there's this whole elaborate like a different gothic novel that the monster basically observes, which I do think, like, obviously I'm joking, I don't think you could reasonably do that in a modern adaptation. It's so of its time, but it is a fun part of the book where you see the ways in which the monster is on the outside, but so is Victor. That this is the kind of gothic novel that Victor should be in. He should be in this crazy gothic romance with his sister, cousin, wife, and all this shit. But instead, he can't really connect to any of those people. But here it's a much more simplified version of it, but it's still very good. I mean, obviously, if you're doing, your psychoanalytic Frankenstein, you can't not have the whole giant voyeur thing in it, because you fucking pervs in your voyeurism and you're just way into it. And so when there's a whole part of the book that is just the monster peeking through a hole at the lives of these people, I mean, that's the most cinematic part of the whole book. You got to get it in there. And it's surprising that it's not more wholesomely done in other adaptations. It's like, it's there in Bride of Frankenstein a little bit, but it is like such a big part of the book. And I do think they do a great job of getting all the important elements of it, of getting the voyeurism piece of it, getting him like learning and developing language, just all this, that as you talked about, the sense of like the shift in tone and space of that they do here through cinematic language, of it being very natural color palettes. And it's him discovering the world and nature for the first time and really kind of understanding it is really good. If there's one piece of criticism I have, is I do think this movie engages in wolf slander, where you have the wolves come and they fucking slaughter the old man and all this shit. And it's like, this is the kind of fucking propaganda that means that most species of wolves are either extinct or they're endangered, because we are a danger to wolves are not a danger to us. It's fucking Jaws and sharks all over again. And it's like, I think you can find other things to do and not have it be fucking wolves somehow break into the house and kill and eat the old man. And it's just, it's maybe not the most environmentally appropriate message to send in your movie.
The wolves are definitely used more metaphorically than they are literally in the film.
Tell that to the dwindling wolf population around the world.
I know. Look, I love wolves. I have one over here. It's a dog, but they descend from wolves. So obviously, I'm pro wolf. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it should have been. I was gonna say maybe it should have been a bear, but no. Bears are also, they don't just willy nilly attack humans. Certainly not old men hanging out in their houses who pose no threat.
Yes, it should have just been a bandit or something. I don't know. Just have it be like a dude who comes in and kills the old man to steal his food. I don't know.
There's other ways to do it, but no, I do love this stretch, and I think it gets like, because that's part of the book is quite literally the heart of the novel. It is the middlemost point. It is the furthest we get away from Walton's perspective. It is like the deepest like entry into perspective from which we then come back out of, right? And it is also where we get like beauty in its most concentrated form in the things the monster observes and how he observes them, but also the frustration and the inhumanity of how much love this creature builds in its heart, and how quickly that is cast away by these people who, other than the old man, don't even really give him a chance. And I think the film gets that thematic heart of it here in a really beautiful way.
Although the monster in this movie does have it way better than the monster in the book. Because it's like, it's definitely one major difference is like when the monster in the book at the end says that even Satan had it better off than me because he had a bunch of fallen angels with him. He's not fucking joking. Like, he has absolutely nothing. In this movie, he's got a nice old man played by David Bradley who teaches him how to read and all this stuff, and they have a good fucking winter together, and he's got a hot lady that's waiting to him. Like, I don't know what the fuck he's complaining about so much. Go make some new friends, man. You're actually pretty good at it. You're better than fucking Victor was.
Well, to be fair, this is a version that ends with the monster alive and heading off towards, which I like. I really do love having a version where the monster gets like, and this also is the redemptive like part of the movie, but I like imagining a version where the monster gets to go off and figure out what its life is. and definitely of a piece with how Del Toro ends his Pinocchio as well. And it's just something I liked to see, because I like the monster, and I'm sad he's going to kill himself in the book. I want him to go find something nice out there for himself.
Does Pinocchio in the Pinocchio movie just rip people to pieces and just fucking like rip their jaws off and shit like that? Maybe I need to watch that movie.
No, but other stuff that is equivalently weird happens in that movie. I'll just say that. Yeah. It's a weird
but no,
movie.
But no Pinocchio murder.
Not to my memory, but honestly, if it could have happened, that movie is weird. That movie is a hell of a thing.
Oh my God. I just came up with the greatest scene in the history of Pinocchio movies, Jonathan. It's Pinocchio's like held at gunpoint or something, and he's seemingly going to die, and he's got no way out, and then he tells the biggest lie in the world, and his nose grows and just right through the dude's eye and kills him.
Remember when I said I'd kill you last? Boom! I lied. Arnold Schwarzenegger as Pinocchio, coming this summer to a theater near you. I would watch, unironically, the shit out of that movie. Oh my God.
I want Pinocchio Commando, and I want it yesterday. Guillermo del Toro, you've got a sequel to write.
All right. We already mainly talked about the ending. I love a lot of the writing near the end. There's some really beautiful just turns of phrase where, like, you have the forgiveness scene. You have that final, like I said, it's kind of like a confessional, a deathbed confessional, where Victor is both God and sinner, and the monster is both, child worshiper, but also priest, receiving the final confession. And there's these lines. One of the lines I love is he tells the monster, "Forgive yourself into existence," which is that is Catholicism using its powers for good. That is a beautiful sentiment you get from religion, saying, while you are alive, what recourse do you have but to live? And then the monster's final line to Frankenstein as he's dying is, "Perhaps we can now both be human." And I think just the writing in that entire last scene is gorgeous.
Yes, yeah, I definitely love the dialogue there. I do think the dialogue can be a bit hit or miss in the movie. Like, I think in some of the scenes like that one, it lands really well. There are some times where it feels like he's trying to evoke the Shelley style, or just sort of a generic, 19th century Victorian English style. And it doesn't really land very well. Like, the Christoph Waltz character has some of those where it's like it's trying to be a bit much. Or there's just some lines that are kind of weird clunkers, like... I do think when William dies and he looks at Victor and says, "But you are the monster," is like a little bit too on the nose, and it's, it's not like it's a major issue with the movie. I think it only stands out to me in particular because I so recently watched Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, and there's just nobody who can fucking capture period dialogue like he does in his movies. And it's like, this movie is much better at it, honestly, than most films are, which don't even try really to do much with the language. And I do think that in general, when Del Toro, either in some of those scenes like at the end where he clearly has such a huge personal investment in like what's happening in that scene, that there's some very beautiful dialogue there. And I think there are other moments where he's not directly quoting Shelley, but he's basing it very closely off of Shelley, and there are lots of lines that are modifications of lines from the book, like the line of the monster saying, "You may be my creator, but I'm your master," or exactly how he phrases it. It's not the exact line from the book, but it's clear that he's looking at the book and he's trying to sort of absorb the language and process it in a way that works in the scope of a screenplay that isn't a page-long speech. And I think when he does that, he generally does a pretty good job of it. But there are these moments where you get these like weird, clunky pieces of dialogue, and there's this kind of sense of where the style isn't like wholly unified across the movie, and there are just lines that feel like they're suddenly out of time, or they're kind of like out of the chronology of the film, and they just feel like modern Hollywood lines, like the "You are a monster." It's just like it kind of takes you out of it for a moment, but. That's like a minor quibble, but it's definitely something I noticed about the movie.
It's a fair critique, and I will say I have that critique probably of every Guillermo del Toro movie I've seen, at least the ones in English, right? Like, I do think he is... It's as he talked about, like, that being someone for whom English is a second language, he approaches it differently than a native speaker would. And I think that can, and I'm not trying to like put all of this to that, because that would obviously be weird and unfair. But I do think like he's a writer who can have moments where I think he can wind up writing something that feels blunt in kind of a bad way where it just doesn't fit, like the "you are the monster." Or the line about like, "I will be the crow pecking at your liver," which I think is probably the worst line in the movie. But I think that bluntness can also go in other directions where like he's able to say the thing in a forthright but kind of poetic way. Like, I don't know if anyone else would write the line, "forgive yourself into existence," some of that kind of stuff. Like, and so I find that with Del Toro. I think it's one of the reasons he's an interesting writer. I think the Shape of Water plays this way for me a little bit too, where like there can be moments where I'm like, okay, this feels overly on the nose, but then 2 minutes later you'll have a line that is beautiful and poetic in the right way. And sometimes you just get both from the same person, and that's okay. And I think you see that at work here in this film very much.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like the like having it have to be period English, again, he's not trying to have it be exactly that style, but evoke that style. I think that adds another kind of wrinkle to it.
Again, I want to just praise up and down the Alexandre Desplat. I never know how to say his name, and I'm sorry to anyone French listening, but we've already said "fuck you" to France from Sean, so fuck him. But I do think the one good thing your country ever produced, Alexandre No, I'm kidding. But
that and baguettes. Baguettes are pretty good.
Okay. Anyway, I think he's one of the great modern film composers. I generally, anytime his name comes up in a film, I know I'm going to enjoy the music. But this is one of my favorite scores he's done. I think particularly the way it builds, that it really opens up a whole other aspect of itself when you switch to the creature's story. And that stretch, because it is effectively a long montage showing months passing, is so musically driven, and so much of how we view the monster is through the leitmotifs that come up in that stretch and the way it does the instrumentation. I just think this is a stunning soundtrack of the likes that we don't get much these days in big expensive movies, and is depressing, but Desplat is always reliable, and I think this is one of his best film scores.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just a fantastic score, and it's just part of like the whole like production of the movie is so good. Like whatever quibbles I have with like the screenplay stuff, and I do think the movie has some messiness there, just the like production design, acting, costumes, editing, film, like cinematography, music, that whole part of it. I mean, Guillermo del Toro is obviously he's a great director, and he's at this point an incredibly experienced director who's made a lot of movies, and there's just like everything feels so fucking rock solid from that perspective. And it's just very like refreshing to see a modern movie like that, because that's not always the case, that there are, and it's obviously never been the case. There's always, professionally made big budget things that somehow have like aspects to it that are incredibly amateurish, but particularly in our modern era with like the green screen stuff and all of that, you do run into these movies that you're like, how the fuck did this get made? And this is more of a like, how the fuck did this get made? It's so good. It's not a like, how did anyone hire people to do this? Or how come nobody looked at the schedule and realized that you can't just do this movie effect in 2 days and just fucked over all these special effects people? All this movie just feels so well planned and produced and considered, and that's very refreshing.
Oh, very much so. The sets in this film are unreal. They're all practical. Like, there is some CGI in this film, mostly to, like, extend the back of sets and stuff like that. And once in a while, the CGI is iffy. The scene where the tower blows up, which has to be done with more CGI, there are some iffy effects there. But I kind of don't care, because if something's going to be iffy, whatever, that's fine. The sets that they are on and the costumes they're interacting with and all of that is so real, so tangible, so physical. And it's really stunning. And then the cinematography by Dan Lauston is so good at, like, making things feel big. This is a hard thing to explain, but there's something about this movie where I've seen it in theaters, I've seen it on my TV, and even on my TV, the images are just so big. They invite you into the environments. There's a scope and a scale to them that I think is rare and is very, very cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just a gorgeous looking movie, and particularly the costuming as well is so good. Like particularly the dresses for the Elizabeth character and for the mom are just like, they went like above and beyond the Call of Duty and just creating these very elaborate, gorgeous dresses that I think just the atmosphere of the movie like immediately is so thick because of all that production design stuff.
Absolutely. All right. Well, anything else to say about this one in particular, Sean?
Obviously I have some of my issues with some of the screenplay, and we talked about that, but overall I do think it's a very good movie, and it's a really cool version of Frankenstein. And that's the most important part. Kind of like what you were saying earlier. It's not just like trying to replicate the novel on screen, which is a fool's errand with this book for a whole bunch of reasons. It is a reaction to what the book is doing through the lens of Guillermo del Toro. And there's messiness that gets involved with that, but there is a really awesome product on the other end that does give you just a different kind of look at it, a different perspective on the story. And I really appreciate that a lot.
Sean, have you seen, I ask you this every time Guillermo del Toro comes up on the podcast, have you seen Crimson Peak yet?
No, I have not.
Okay, it's the one I just know it would be his favorite movie, your favorite movie of his. It is such a phenomenal modern version of the Gothic romance. It has a lot of the strengths of this Frankenstein, but it also is telling a fully original story, and I think it does it very well. The set design in that one is just off the charts. Anyway, I feel like I need to recommend that every couple of years, because that's also a movie that like didn't make much of an impression when it came out, but it has its cult following, of which I am a very proud member. And I'm always telling people to go watch Crimson Peak.
All right, well, I'll have to check that one out. I'm in a bit of a, because I did, again, I know that maybe there might have been parts of this conversation where I sounded negative on the movie, but I enjoyed it a lot, and it got me in a mood of like I should watch some more Guillermo del Toro movies, because I've seen quite a few of them, but like far from all of them. For instance, I have not seen Crimson Peak, and I have not seen Pinocchio.
There you go.
Even though I'm sure my hopes of Pinocchio brutally murdering someone by lying and having his nose extend through his brain is going to be dashed by the actual film, I'll still be able to have fun watching it and imagining that scene being in it. And that's more than I can say for most movies.